Book 3, The Wilderness, Chapter 1, The Homecoming. It was still early morning when we came into town of Mondolfo, my peasant escort and I. The day being Sunday, there was little stir in the town at such an hour, and it presented a very different appearance from that which it had worn when last I had seen it. But the difference lay not only in the absence of bustle, and the few folk abroad now as compared with that market day on which, departing, I had ridden through it. I viewed the place today with eyes that were able to draw comparisons, and after the wide streets and imposing buildings of Piacenza, I found my little township mean and rustic. We passed the Duomo, consecrated to Our Lady of Mondolfo. Its portal stood wide, and in the opening swung a heavy crimson curtain, embroidered with a huge golden cross, which was bellying outward like an enormous gonfalon. On the steps a few crippled beggars whined, and a few faithful took their way to early mass. Up the steep, ill-paved street we climbed to the mighty gray citadel looming on the hill's crest, like a gigantic guardian brooding over the city of his trust. We crossed the drawbridge unchallenged, passed under the tunnel of the gateway, and so came into the vast, untenanted bailey of the fortress. I looked about me, beat my hands together, and raised my voice to shout, "Ola! Ola!" In answer to my call, the door of the guardhouse opened presently, and a man looked out. He frowned at first, then his brows went up and his mouth fell open. "It is the Madonnino," he shouted over his shoulder, and hurried forward to take my reins, uttering words of respectful welcome, which seemed to relieve the fears of my peasant, who had never quite believed me what I proclaimed myself. There was a stir in the guardhouse, and 2 or 3 men of the absurd garrison my mother kept there shuffled in the doorway, whilst a burly fellow in leather with a sword girt on him thrust his way through and hurried forward, limping slightly. In the dark, lowering face I recognized my old friend Rinaldo, and I marveled to see him thus accoutred. He halted before me and gave me a stiff and unfriendly salute. Then he bade the man-at-arms to hold my stirrup. "What is your authority here, Rinaldo?" I asked him shortly. "I am the Castellan," he informed me. "The Castellan? But what of Messer Giorgio?" "He died a month ago." "And who gave you this authority?" "Madonna the Countess, in some recompense for the hurt you did me," he replied, thrusting forward his lame leg. His tone was surly and hostile, but provoked no resentment in me now. I deserved his unfriendliness. I had crippled him. At the moment I forgot the provocation I had received. Forgot that since he had raised his hand to his lord, it would have been no great harshness to have hanged him. I saw in him but another instance of my wickedness, another sufferer at my hands. And I hung my head under the rebuke implicit in his surly tone and glance. "I had not thought, Rinaldo, to do you an abiding hurt," said I, and here checked, bethinking me that I lied. For had I not expressed regret that I had not broken his neck? I got down slowly and painfully, for my limbs were stiff and my feet very sore. He smiled darkly at my words and my sudden faltering, but I affected not to see. "Where is Madonna?" I asked. "She will have returned by now from chapel," he answered. I turned to the man-at-arms. "You will announce me." I bade him. "And you, Rinaldo, see to these beasts and to this good fellow here. Let him have wine and food and what he needs. I will see him again ere he sets forth." Rinaldo muttered that all should be done as I ordered, and I signed to the man-at-arms to lead the way. We went up the steps and into the cool of the great hall. There the soldier, whose every feeling had been outraged no doubt by Rinaldo's attitude towards his lord, ventured to express his sympathy and indignation. "Rinaldo is a black beast, Madonnino," he muttered. "We are all black beasts, Eugenio." I answered heavily, and so startled him by words and tone that he ventured upon no further speech, but led me straight to my mother's private dining room, opened the door, and calmly announced me. "Madonna, here is my Lord Agostino." I heard the gasp she uttered before I caught sight of her. She was seated at the table's head in her great wooden chair, and Fra Gervasio was pacing the rust-strewn floor and talked with her, his hands behind his back, his head thrust forward. At the announcement, he straightened suddenly and wheeled round to face me, inquiry in his glance. My mother, too, half rose and remained so, staring at me, her amazement at seeing me increased by the strange appearance I presented. Eugenio closed the door and departed, leaving me standing there just within it, and for a moment no word was spoken. The cheerless, familiar room looking more cheerless than it had done of old, with its high-set windows and ghastly crucifix, affected me in a singular manner. In this room I had known a sort of peace, the peace that is peculiarly childhood's own, whatever the troubles that may haunt it. I came into it now with hell in my soul, sin blackened before God and man, a fugitive in quest of sanctuary. A knot rose in my throat and paralyzed a while my speech. Then with a sudden sob, I sprang forward and hobbled to her upon my wounded feet. I flung myself down upon my knees, buried my head in her lap, and all that I could cry was, "Mother, mother." Whether perceiving my disorder, my distraught and suffering condition, what remained of the woman in her was moved to pity. Whether my cry acted like a rod of Moses upon that rock of her heart, which excessive piety had long since sterilized, touched into fresh life the springs that had long since been dry, and reminded her of the actual bond between us, her tone was more kindly and gentle than I had ever known it. "Agostino, my child, why are you here?" And her wax-like fingers very gently touched my head. "Why are you here? And thus, what has happened to you?" "Me miserable," I groaned. "What is it?" She pressed me, an increasing anxiety in her voice. At last I found courage to tell her sufficient to prepare her mind. "Mother, I am a sinner." I faltered miserably. I felt her recoiling from me as from the touch of something unclean and contagious, her mind conceiving already by some subtle premonition some shadow of the thing that I had done. And then Gervasio spoke, and his voice was soothing as oil upon troubled waters. "Sinners are we all, Agostino, but repentance purges sin. Do not abandon yourself to despair, my son." But the mother who bore me took no such charitable and Christian view. "What is it? Wretched boy, what have you done?" And the cold repugnance in her voice froze anew the courage I was forming. "Oh, God help me! God help me!" I groaned miserably. Gervasio, seeing my condition, with that quick and saintly sympathy that was his, came softly towards me and set a hand upon my shoulder. "Dear Agostino," he murmured, "would you find it easy to tell me first? Will you confess to me, my son? Will you let me lift this burden from your soul?" Still on my knees, I turned and looked up into that pale, kindly face. I caught his thin hand, and kissed it ere he could snatch it away. "If there were more priests like you," I cried, "there would be fewer sinners like me." A shadow crossed his face. He smiled very wanly, a smile that was like a gleam of pale sunshine from an overclouded sky, and he spoke in gentle, soothing words of the divine mercy. I staggered to my bruised feet. "I will confess to you, Fra Gervasio," I said, "and afterwards we will tell my mother." She looked as she would make demur, but Fra Gervasio checked any such intent. "It is best so, Madonna," he said gravely. "His most urgent need is a consolation that the Church alone can give." He took me by the arm very gently and led me forth. We went to his modest chamber, with his wax floor, the hard, narrow pallet upon which he slept, the blue and gold image of the Virgin, and the little writing pulpit upon which lay open a manuscript he was illuminating, for he was very skilled in that art which already was falling into desuetude. At this pulpit by the window, he took his seat and signed to me to kneel. I recited the Confiteor. Thereafter, with my face buried in my hands, my soul writhing in an agony of penitence and shame, I poured out the hideous tale of the evil I had wrought. Rarely did he speak while I was at that recitation. Save when I halted or hesitated, he would interject a word of pity and of comfort that fell like a blessed balsam upon my spiritual wounds and gave me strength to pursue my awful story. When I had done, and he knew me to the full for the murderer and adulterer that I was, there fell a long pause, during which I waited as a felon awaits sentence. But it did not come. Instead, he set himself to examine more closely the thing I had told him. He probed it with a question here and a question there, and all of a shrewdness that revealed the extent of his knowledge of humanity and the infinite compassion and gentleness that must be the inevitable fruits of such sad knowledge. He caused me to go back to the very day of my arrival at Fafani's, and thence, step by step, he led me again over the road that in the past 4 months I had trodden, until he had traced the evil to its very source, and could see the tiny spring that had formed the brook which, gathering volume as it went, had swollen at last into a raging torrent that had laid waste its narrow confines. "Who that knows all that goes to the making of a sin shall dare to condemn a sinner?" he cried at last, so that I looked up at him, startled and penetrated by a ray of hope and comfort. He returned my glance with one of infinite pity. "It is the woman here upon whom must fall the greater blame," said he. But at that I cried out in hot remonstrance, adding that I had yet another vileness to confess. For it was now that for the first time I realized it, and I related to him how last night I had repudiated her, cast her off and fled, leaving her to bear the punishment alone of my conduct, in that he withheld his criticism. "The sin is hers," he repeated. "She was a wife, and the adultery is hers. More, she was a seducer. It was she who debauched your mind with lascivious readings, and tore away the foundations of virtue from your soul. If in the cataclysm that followed she was crushed and smothered, it is no more than she had incurred." I still protested that this view was all too lenient to me, that it sprang of his love for me, that it was not just. Thereupon he began to make clear to me many things that may have been clear to you worldly ones who have read my scrupulous and exact confessions, but which at the time were still all wrapped in obscurity for me. It was as if he held up a mirror, an intelligent and informing mirror, in which my deeds were reflected by the light of his own deep knowledge. He showed me the gradual seduction to which I had been subjected. He showed me Juliana as she really was, as she must be for what I told him. He reminded me that she was older by 10 years than I, and greatly skilled in men and worldliness, that where I had gone blindly, never seeing what was the inevitable goal and end of the road I trod, she had consciously been leading me thither, knowing full well what the end must be, and desiring it. As for murder for Fanny, the thing was grievous, but it had been done in the heat of combat, and he could not think that I had meant the poor man's death. And for Fanny himself was not entirely without blame. Largely had he contributed to the tragedy. There had been evil in his heart. A good man would have withdrawn his wife from surroundings which he knew to be perilous and foul, not used her as a decoy to enable him to trap and slay his enemy. And the greatest blame of all he attached to that Messer Arcolano, who had recommended for Fanny to my mother as a tutor for me, knowing full well, as he must have known, what manner of house the doctor kept and what manner of one was Juliana. Arcolano had sought to serve for Fanny's interests in pretending to serve mine and my mother's, and my mother should be enlightened that at last she might know that evil man for what he really was. But all this, he concluded, does not mean, Agostino, that you are to regard yourself as other than a great sinner. You have sinned monstrously, even when all these extenuations are considered. I know, I groaned. But beyond forgiveness no man has ever sinned, nor have you now, so that your repentance is deep and real, and when by some penance that I shall impose you shall cleanse yourself of all this mire that clings to your poor soul, you shall have absolution from me. Impose your penance, I cried eagerly. There is none I will not undertake, to purchase pardon and some little peace of mind. I will consider it, he answered gravely. And now let us seek your mother. She must be told. For a great deal hangs upon this, Agostino. The career to which you were destined is no longer for you, my son. My spirit quailed under those last words, and yet I felt an immense relief at the same time, as if some overwhelming burden had been lifted from me. I am indeed unworthy, I said. It is not your unworthiness that I am considering, my son, but your nature. The world calls you over strongly. It is not for nothing that you are the child of Giovanni d'Anguissola. His blood runs thick in your veins, and it is very human blood. For such as you there is no hope in the cloister. Your mother must be made to realize it, and she must abandon her dreams concerning you. It will wound her very sorely. But better that than, he shrugged and rose. Come, Agostino. And I rose too, immensely comforted and soothed already, for all that I was yet very far from ease or peace of mind. Outside his room, he set a hand upon my arm. Wait, he said, we have ministered in some degree to your poor spirit. Let us take thought for the body, too. You need garments and other things. Come with me. He led me up to my own little chamber, took fresh raiment for me from a press, called Lorenza and bade her bring bread and wine, vinegar and warm water. In a very weak dilution of the latter, he bade me bathe my lacerated feet, and then he found fine strips of linen in which to bind them ere I drew fresh hose and shoes. And meanwhile, munching my bread and salt, and taking great draughts of the pure, if somewhat sour wine, my mental peace was increased by the refreshment of my body. At last I stood up more myself than I had been these last 12 awful hours. For it was just noon, and into 12 hours had been packed events that well might have filled a lifetime. He put an arm about my shoulder, fondly as a father might have done, and so led me below again and into my mother's presence. We found her kneeling before the crucifix, telling her beads, and we stood waiting a few moments in silence until a sigh and a rustle of her stiff black dress, she rose gently and turned to face us. My heart thudded violently in that moment, as I looked into that pale face of sorrow. Then Fra Gervasio began to speak, very gently and softly. "Your son, Madonna, has been lured into sin by a wanton woman," he began, and there she interrupted him with a sudden and very piteous cry. "Not that! Ah, not that!" she exclaimed, putting out hands gropingly before her. "That and more, Madonna," he answered gravely. "Be brave to hear the rest. It is a very piteous story. But the fountains of divine mercy are inexhaustible, and Agostino shall drink therefrom when by penitence he shall have cleansed his lips." Very erect she stood there, silent and ghostly, her face looking diaphanous by contrast with the black draperies that enshrouded her, whilst her eyes were great pools of sorrow. Poor, poor mother! It is the last recollection I have of her. For after that day we never met again, and I would give 10 years to purgatory if I might recall the last words that passed between us. As briefly as possible, and ever thrusting into the foreground the immensity of the snare that had been spread for me and the temptation that had enmeshed me, Gervasio told her the story of my sin. She heard him through in that immovable attitude, one hand pressed to her heart, her poor pale lips moving now and again, but no sound coming from them, her face a white mass of pain and horror. When he had done, so wrought upon was I by the sorrow of that countenance, that I went forward again to fling myself upon my knees before her. "Mother, forgive," I pleaded, and getting no answer, I put up my hands to take hers. "Mother," I cried, and the tears were streaming down my face. But she recoiled before me. "Are you my child?" she asked in a voice of horror. "Are you the thing that has grown out of that little child I vowed to chastity and to God? Then has my sin overtaken me, the sin of bearing a son to Giovanni d'Anguissola, that enemy of God." "Ah, mother, mother," I cried again, thinking perhaps by that all-powerful word to move her yet to pity and to gentleness. "Madonna," cried Gervasio, "be merciful if you would look for mercy." "He has falsified my vows," she answered stonily. "He was my votive offering for the life of his impious father. I am punished for the unworthiness of my offering and the unworthiness of the cause in which I offered it. Accursed is the fruit of my womb." She moaned and sank her head upon her breast. "I will atone," I cried, overwhelmed to see her so distraught. She wrung her pale hands. "Atone!" she cried, and her voice trembled. "Go, then, and atone, but never let me see you more. Never let me be reminded of the sinner to whom I have given life. Go, begone." And she raised a hand in tragical dismissal. I shrank back and came slowly to my feet. And then Gervasio spoke, and his voice boomed and thundered with righteous indignation. "Madonna, this is inhuman," he denounced. "Shall you dare to hope for mercy, being yourself unmerciful?" "I shall pray for strength to forgive him, but the sight of him might tempt me back with the memory of the thing that he has done," she answered, and she returned to that cold and terrible reserve of hers. And then things that Fra Gervasio had repressed for years welled up in a mighty flood. "He is your son, and he is as you have made him." "As I have made him?" quoth she, and her glance challenged the friar. "By what right did you make of him a votive offering? By what right did you seek to consecrate a child unborn to a claustral life without thought of his character, without reck of the desires that should be his? By what right did you make yourself the arbiter of the future of a man unborn?" "By what right?" quoth she. "Are you a priest? And do you ask me by what right I vowed him to the service of God? And is there, think you, no way of serving God but in the sterility of the cloister?" he demanded. "Why? Since no man is born to damnation, and since by your reason the world must mean damnation, then all men should be encloistered, and soon, thus, there will be an end to man. You are too arrogant, Madonna, when you presume to judge what pleases God. Beware lest you fall into the sin of the Pharisee, for often have I seen you stand in danger of it." She swayed as if her strength were failing her, and again her pale lips moved. "Enough, Fra Gervasio. I will go, I cried. Nay, it is not yet enough, he answered, and strode down the room until he stood between her and me. He is what you have made him, he repeated in denunciation. Had you studied his nature and his inclinations, had you left him free to develop along the way that God intended, you would have seen whether or not the cloister called him, and then would have been the time to have taken a resolve. But you thought to change his nature by repressing it. And you never saw that if he was not such as you would have him be, then most surely would you doom him to damnation by making an evil priest of him. In your Pharisaic arrogance, Madonna, you sought to superimpose your will to God's will concerning him. You confounded God's will with your own, and so his sins recoil upon you as much as upon any. Therefore, Madonna, do I bid you beware. Take a humbler view, if you would be acceptable in the divine sight. Learn to forgive. For I say to you today that you stand as greatly in need of forgiveness of the thing that Agostino has done, as does Agostino himself. He paused at last, and stood trembling before her, his eyes aflame, his high cheekbones faintly tinted, and she measured him very calmly and coldly with her somber eyes. Are you a priest? She asked with steady scorn. Are you indeed a priest? And then her invective was loosened, and her voice shrilled and mounted as her anger swayed her. What a snake have I harbored here, she cried. Blasphemer, you show me clearly whence came the impiety and ungodliness of Giovanni d'Anguissola. It had the same source as your own. It was suckled at your mother's breast. A sob shook him. My mother is dead, Madonna, he rebuked her. She is more blessed then than I, since she has not lived to see what a power for sin she has brought forth. Go, pitiful friar. Go, both of you. You are very choicely mated. Begone from Mondolfo, and never let me see either of you more. She staggered to her great chair and sank into it, whilst we stood there mute, regarding her. For myself, it was with difficulty that I repressed the burning things that rose to my lips. Had I given free rein to my tongue, I had made of it a whip of scorpions. And my anger sprang not from the things she said to me, but from what she said to that saintly man who held out a hand to help me out of the morass of sin in which I was being sunk. That he, that sweet and charitable follower of his master, should be abused by her, should be dubbed blasphemer, and have the cherished memory of his mother defiled by her pietistic utterances, was something that inflamed me horribly. But he set a hand upon my shoulder. Come, Agostino, he said very gently. He was calm once more. We will go, as we are bidden, you and I. And then, out of the sweetness of his nature, he forged all unwittingly the very iron that should penetrate most surely into her soul. Forgive her, my son. Forgive her as you need forgiveness. She does not understand the things she does. Come, we will pray for her, that God in his infinite mercy may teach her humility and true knowledge of him. I saw her start as if she had been stung. Blasphemer, begone! She cried again, and her voice was hoarse with suppressed anger. And then the door was suddenly flung open, and Rinaldo clanked in, very martial and important, his hand thrusting up his sword behind him. Madonna, he announced, the captain of justice from Piacenza is here. Chapter 2. The captain of justice. There was a moment's silence after Rinaldo had flung that announcement. The captain of justice? Quoth my mother at length, her voice startled. What does he seek? The person of my lord Agostino d'Anguissola, said Rinaldo steadily. She sighed very heavily. A felon's end, she murmured, and turned to me. If thus you may expiate your sins, she said, speaking more gently, let the will of heaven be done. Admit the captain, said Rinaldo. He bowed and turned sharply to depart. Stay, I cried, and rooted him there by the imperative note of my command. Fra Gervasio was more than right when he said that mine was not a nature for cloister. In that moment, I might have realized it to the full by the readiness with which the thought of battle occurred to me, and more by the anticipatory glow that warmed me at the very thought of it. I was the very son of Giovanni d'Anguissola. What force attends a captain? I inquired. He has 6 mounted men with him, replied Rinaldo. In that case, I answered, you will bid him begone in my name. And if he should not go, was Rinaldo's impudent question, you will tell him that I will drive him hence, him and his braves. We keep a garrison of 100 men at least, sufficient to compel him to depart. He will return again with more. said Rinalfo. Does that concern you? I snapped. Let him return with what he pleases. Today I enroll more forces from a countryside. Take up the bridge and mount our cannon. This is my lair and fortress, and I'll defend it myself as becomes my name and blood. For I am the lord and master here, and the lore of Mondolfo is not to be dragged away thus at the heels of a captain of justice. You have my orders. Obey them. About it, sir. Circumstances had shown me the way that I must take, and the folly of going forth a fugitive outcast at my mother's bidding. I was lord of Mondolfo, as I had said, and they should know and feel it from this hour, all of them, not excepting my mother. But I reckon without the hatred Rinalfo bore me. Instead of the prompt obedience that I had looked for, he had turned again to my mother. Is it your wish, Madonna? He inquired. It is my wish that counts, you knave. I thundered and advanced upon him, but he fronted me intrepidly. I hold my office from my lady the countess. I obey none other here. Body of God, do you defy me? I cried, am I lord of Mondolfo, or am I a lackey in my own house? ULD best obey me ere I break you. Said Rinalfo. We shall see whether the men will take my orders, I added confidently. The faintest smile illumined his dark face. The men will not stir a finger at the bidding of any but Madonna the Countess and myself, he answered heartily. It was by an effort that I refrained from striking him, and then my mother spoke again. It is, as Sir Rinalfo says, she informed me, so cease this futile resistance, sir son, and accept the expiation that is offered you. I looked at her, she avoiding my glance. Madonna, I cannot think that it is so, said I. These men have known me since I was a little lad. Many of them have followed the fortunes of my father. They'll never turn their backs upon a son in the hour of his need. They are not all so inhuman as my mother. You mistake, sir, said Rinalfo. Of the men you knew, but one or two remain. Most of our present force has been enrolled by me in the past month. This was defeat, utter and pitiful. His tone was too confident. He was too sure of his ground to leave me a doubt as to what would befall if I made appeal to his knavish followers. My arms felt my sides, and I looked at Gervasio. His face was haggard, and his eyes were very full of sorrow as they rested on me. It is true, Agostino, he said. And as he spoke, Rinalfo limped out of the room to fetch the captain of justice, as my mother had bidden him, and his lips smiled cruelly. Madam Mother, I said bitterly, you do a monstrous thing. You usurp the power that is mine, and you deliver me, your son, to the gallows. I hope that hereafter, when you come to realize to the full your deed, you will be able to give your conscience peace. My first duty is to God, she answered, and to that pitiable answer there was nothing to be rejoined. So I turned my shoulder to her and stood waiting, Fra Gervasio beside me, clenching his hands, his impotence and mute despair. And then an approaching clank of mail heralded the coming of the captain. Rinalfo held the door, and Cosimo d'Anguissola entered with firm, proud tread, two of his men, following at his heels. He wore a buff coat, under which no doubt there would be a shirt of mail. His gorget and wristlets were of polished steel, and his headgear was a steel cap under a cover of peach-colored velvet. Thigh boots encased his legs. Sword and dagger hung in the silver carriages at his belt. His handsome, aquiline face was very solemn. He bowed profoundly to my mother, who rose to respond, and then he flashed me one swift glance of his piercing eyes. I deplore my business here, he announced shortly. No doubt it will be known to you already. And he looked at me again, allowing his eyes to linger on my face. I am ready, sir, I said. Then we had best be going, for I understand that none could be less welcome here than I. Yet in this, Madonna, let me assure you that there is nothing personal to myself. I am the slave of my office. I do but perform it. So much protesting where no doubt have been expressed, said Fra Gervasio, in itself casts a doubt upon your good faith. Are you not Cosimo d'Anguissola, my lord's cousin heir? I am, said he, yet that has no part in this, Sir Friar. Then let it have part. Let it have the part it should have. Will you bear one of your own name and blood to the gallows? What will men say of that when they perceive your profit in the deed? Cosimo looked him boldly between the eyes, his hawk face very white. Sir priest, I know not by what right you address me so, but you do me wrong. I am the Podesta Piacenza bound by an oath that it would dishonor me to break, and break it I must or else fulfill my duty here. Enough, he added, in his haughty, peremptory fashion. Sir Agostino, I await your pleasure. I will appeal to Rome, cried Fra Gervasio, now beside himself with grief. Cosimo smiled darkly, pityingly. It is to be feared that Rome will turn a deaf ear to appeals on behalf of the son of Giovanni d'Anguissola. And with that he motioned me to precede him. Silently I pressed Fra Gervasio's hand, and on that departed without so much as another look at my mother, who sat there a silent witness of the scene which she approved. The men-at-arms fell into step, one on either side of me, and so we passed out into the courtyard, where Cosimo's other men were waiting, and where was gathered the entire family of the castle, a gaping, rather frightened little crowd. They brought forth a mule for me, and I mounted. Then suddenly there was Fra Gervasio at my side again. I too am going hence, he said. Be of good courage, Agostino. There is no effort I will not make on your behalf. In a broken voice he added his farewells ere he stood back at the captain's peremptory bidding. The little troop closed round me, and thus, within a couple hours of my coming, I departed again from Mondolfo, surrendered to hangman by the pious hands of my mother, who on her knees, no doubt, would be thanking God for having afforded her the grace to act in so righteous a manner. Once only did my cousin address me, and that was soon after we had left the town behind us. He motioned the men away and rode to my side. Then he looked at me with mocking, hating eyes. You had done better to have continued in your saint's trade than to become so very magnificent a sinner, said he. I did not answer him, and he rode on beside me in silence some little way. Ah, well, he sighed at last. Your course has been a brief one, but very eventful. And who would have suspected so very fierce a wolf under so sheepish an outside? Body of God, you fooled us all, you and that white-faced troll. He said it through his teeth with such a concentration of rage in his tones that it was easy to guess where the sore rankled. I looked at him gravely. Does it become you, sir, do you think, to gird at one who is your prisoner? And did you not gird at me when it was your turn? He flashed back fiercely. Did not you and she laugh together over that poor, fond fool Cosimo whose money she took so very freely, and yet who seems to have been the only one excluded from her favors? You lie, you dog. I blazed at him, so fiercely that the men turned in their saddles. He paled, and half raised a gauntlet hand in which he carried his whip, but he controlled himself and barked an order to his followers. Ride on there. When they had drawn off a little, and we were alone again, I do not lie, sir, he said. It is a practice which I leave to shavelings of all degrees. If you say that she took aught from you, then you lie. I repeated. He considered me steadily. Fool, he said at last. Whence else came her jewels and fine clothes? From Fafani. Do you think that impecunious pedant? Or perhaps you imagine that it was from Gambara. In time that grasping prelate might have made the Duke pay. But pay himself? By the blood of God, he was never known to pay for anything. Or, yet again, do you suppose her finery was afforded her by Caro? Messer Annibale Caro, who is so much in debt that he is never like to return to Piacenza, unless some dote of a patron rewards him for his poetass's labors. No, my shaveling. It was I who paid, I who was a fool. God, I more than suspected the others. But you saint, you! He flung up his head and laughed bitterly and unpleasantly. Ah, well, he ended, you are to pay, though in different kind. It is in the family, you see. And abruptly raising his voice, he shouted to the men to wait. Thereafter he rode ahead, alone and gloomy. Whilst no less alone and gloomy rode, I amid my guards. The thing he had revealed to me had torn away a veil from my silly eyes. It had made me understand 100 little matters that hitherto had been puzzling me. And I saw how utterly and fatuously blind I had been to things which even Fra Gervasio had apprehended from just the relation he had drawn from me. It was as we were entering Piacenza by the gate of San Lazzaro that I again drew my cousin to my side. Sir Captain, I called to him, for I could not bring myself to address him as cousin now. He came, inquiry in his eyes. Where is she now? I asked. He stared at me a moment, as if my effrontery astonished him. Then he shrugged and sneered. I would I knew for certain, was his fierce answer. I would I knew, then should I have the pair of you. and I saw in his face how unforgivingly he hated me out of his savage jealousy. My Lord Gambara might tell you, I scarcely doubt it. Were I but certain, what a reckoning should I not present? He may be governor of Piacenza, but were he governor of hell, he should not escape me. And with that he rode ahead again and left me. The rumor of our coming sped through the streets ahead of us, and out of the houses poured the townsfolk to watch our passage, and to point me out one to another with many whisperings and solemn head waggings. And the farther we advanced, the greater was the concourse, until by the time we reached the square before the communal palace, we found there what amounted to a mob awaiting us. My guards closed round me as if to protect me from that crowd. But I was strangely without fear, and presently I was to see how little cause there was for any, and to realize that the action of my guard was sprung from a very different motive. The people stood silent, and on every upturned face of which I caught a glimpse, I saw something that was akin to pity. Presently, however, as we drew nearer to palace, a murmur began to rise. It swelled and grew fierce. Suddenly a cry rose vehement and clear. "Rescue! Rescue! He is the Lord of Mondolfo," shouted one tall fellow, "and the cardinal legate makes a cat's paw of him. He is to suffer for Messer Gambara's villainy." Again he was answered by the cry, "Rescue! Rescue!" while some added an angry, "Death to the legate!" Whilst I was deeply marveling at all this, Cosimo looked at me over his shoulder, and though his lips were steady, his eyes seemed to smile, charged with a message of derision, and something more, something that I could not read. Then I heard his hard, metallic voice. "Back there, you curs! To your kennels! Out of the way, or we ride you down." He had drawn his sword, and his white hawk face was so cruel and determined that they fell away before him, and their cries died down. We passed into the courtyard of the communal palace, and the great studded gates were slammed in the faces of the mob and barred. I got down from my mule and was conducted at Cosimo's bidding to one of the dungeons under the palace, where I was left with the announcement that I must present myself tomorrow before the tribunal of the Ruota. I flung myself down upon the dried rushes that had been heaped in a corner to do duty for a bed, and I abandoned myself to my bitter thoughts. In particular, I pondered the meaning of the crowd's strange attitude, nor was it a riddle difficult to resolve. It was evident that believing Gambara, as they did, to be Juliana's lover, and informed, perhaps, invention swelling rumor as it will, that the cardinal legate had ridden late last night to Fafani's house, it had been put about that the foul murder done there was Messer Gambara's work. Thus was the legate reaping the harvest of all the hatred he had sown, of all the tyranny and extortion of his iron rule in Piacenza, and willing to believe any evil of the man they hated. They not only laid Fafani's death at his door, but they went to further lengths and accounted that I was a cat's paw, that I was to be sacrificed to save the legate's face and reputation. They remembered perhaps the ill odor in which we Anguissola of Mondolfo had been at Rome, for the Ghibelline leanings that ever had been ours and for rebellion of my father against the pontifical sway, and their conclusions gathered a sort of confirmation from that circumstance. Long upon the very edge of mutiny and revolt against Gambara's injustice, it had needed but what seemed a crowning one such as this to quicken their hatred into expression. It was all very clear and obvious, and it seemed to me that tomorrow's trial should be very interesting. I had but to deny. I had but to make myself the mouthpiece of the rumor that was abroad, and heaven alone could foretell what the consequences might be. Then I smiled bitterly to myself. Deny? Oh, no. That was a last vileness I could not perpetrate. The Ruota should hear the truth, and Gambara should be left to shelter Juliana, who, Cosimo was assured, had fled to him in her need as to a natural protector. It was a bitter thought. The intensity of that bitterness made me realize with alarm how it still was with me. And pondering this, I fell asleep, utterly worn out in body and in mind by the awful turmoil of that day. Chapter 3. Gambara's Interests. I awakened to find a man standing beside me. He was muffled in a black cloak and carried a lantern. Behind him the door gaped as he had left it. Instantly I sat up, conscious of my circumstance and surroundings, and at my movement this visitor spoke. "You sleep very soundly for a man in your case," said he, and the voice was that of my Lord Gambara, its tone quite coldly critical. He set down the lantern on a stool, when it shed a wheel of yellow light intersected with black beams. His cloak fell apart, and I saw that he was dressed for riding, very plainly, in somber garments and that he was armed. He stood slightly to one side that the light might fall upon my face, leaving his own in shadow. Thus he considered me for some moments in silence. At last, very slowly, very bitterly, shaking his head as he spoke, "You fool, you clumsy fool," he said, having drawn, as you have seen, my own conclusions from the attitude of the mob. I was in little doubt as to the precise bearing of his words. I answered him sincerely. "If folly were all my guilt," said I, "it would be well." He sniffed impatiently. "Still sanctimonious," he sneered. "Tcha! Up now and play the man at least. You have shed your robe of sanctity, Messer Agostino. Have done with pretense." "I do not pretend," I answered him. "And as for playing the man, I shall accept what punishment the law may have for me with fortitude at least, if I can but expiate." "Expiate a fig!" he snapped, interrupting me. "Why do you suppose that I am here?" "I wait to learn." "I am here because through your folly you have undone us all." "What need?" he cried, the anger of expostulation quivering in his voice. "What need was there to kill that Ofafanti?" "He would have killed me," said I. "I slew him in self-defense." "Ha! And do you hope to save your neck with such a plea?" "Nay, I have no thought of urging it. I but tell it you." "There is not the need to tell me anything," he answered, his anger very plain. "I am very well informed of all. Rather, let me tell you something. Do you realize, sir, that you have made it impossible for me to abide another day in Piacenza?" "I am sorry," I began lamely. "Present your regrets to Satan," he snapped. "Me they avail nothing. I am put to the necessity of abandoning my governorship and fleeing by night like a hunted thief, and I have you to thank for it. You see me on the point of departure. My horses wait above. So you may add my ruin to the other fine things you accomplished yesternight. For a saint you are over busy, sir." And he turned away and strode the length of my cell and back, so that at last I had a glimpse of his face, which was drawn and scowling. Gone now was the last vestige of his habitual silkiness. The pomander ball hung neglected, and his delicate fingers tugged viciously at his little pointed beard, his great sapphire ring flashing somberly. "Look you, Ser Agostino, I could kill you and take joy in it. I could, by God." His eyes upon me, he drew from his breast a folded paper. "Instead, I bring you liberty. I open your doors for you and bid you escape. Here, man, take this paper. Present it to the officer at the Podesta gate. He will let you pass, and then away with you, out of the territory of Piacenza." For an instant my heartbeat seemed suspended by astonishment. I swung my legs round and half rose, excitedly. Then I sank back again. My mind was made up. I was tired of the world. Sick of life, the first draught which had turned so bitter in my throat. If by my death I might expiate my sins and win pardon by my submission and humility, it was all I could desire. I should be glad to be released from all the misery and sorrow into which I had been born. I told him so in some few words. "You mean me well, my lord," I ended, "and I thank you, but—" "By God and the saints," he blazed, "I do not mean you well at all. I mean you anything but well. Have I not said that I could kill you with satisfaction? Whatever be the sins of Egidio Gambara, he is no hypocrite, and he lets his enemies see his face unmasked. But then," I cried, amazed, "why do you offer me my freedom?" "Because this cursed populace is in such a temper that if you are brought to trial, I know not what may happen. As likely as not we shall have an insurrection, open revolt against the pontifical authority, and red war in the streets. And this is not the time for it. The Holy Father requires the submission of these people. We are upon the eve of Duke Pierluigi's coming to occupy his new states, and it imports that he should be well received, that he should be given a loving welcome by his subjects. If, instead, they meet him with revolt and defiance, the reasons will be sought, and the blame of the affair will recoil upon me. Your cousin Cosimo will see to that. He is a very subtle gentleman, this cousin of yours, and he has a way of working to his own profit. So now you understand. I have no mind to be crushed in this business. Enough have I suffered already through you. Enough am I suffering in resigning my governorship. So there is but one way out. There must be no trial tomorrow. It must be known that you have escaped. Thus they will be quieted, and the matter will blow over. So now, Ser Agostino, We understand each other. You must go. And whither am I to go? I cried, remembering my mother in that Mondolfo. The only place of safety was closed to me by her cruelly pious hands. Whither, he echoed. What do I care? To hell, anywhere so that you get out of this. I'd sooner hang, said I quite seriously. ULD hang and welcome, for all the love I bear you, he answered, his impatience growing. But if you hang, blood will be shed, innocent lives will be lost, and I myself may come to suffer. For you, sir, I care nothing, I answered him, taking his own tone, and returning him the same brutal frankness that he used with me. That you deserve to suffer, I do not doubt. But since other blood than yours might be shed, as you say, since innocent lives might be lost, give me the paper. He was frowning upon me, and smiling viperishly at the same time. I like your frankness better than your piety, said he. So now we understand each other, and know that neither is in the other's debt. Hereafter beware of Egidio Gambara. I give you this last loyal warning. See that you do not come into my way again. I rose and looked at him, looked down from my greater height. I knew well the source of this last, parting show of hatred. Like Cosimo's, it sprang from jealousy, and a growth more potential of evil does not exist. He bore my glance a moment, then turned and took up the lantern. Come, he said, and obediently I followed him up the winding stone staircase, and so to the very gates of the palace. We met no one. What had become of the guards, I cannot think, but I am satisfied that Gambara himself had removed them. He opened the wicket for me, and as I stepped out, he gave me the paper and whistled softly. Almost at once I heard a sound of muffled hooves under the colonnade, and presently loomed the figures of a man and a mule, both dim and ghostly in the pearly light of dawn, for that was the hour. Gambara followed me out and pulled the wicket after him. That beast is for you, he said curtly. It will the better enable you to get away. As curtly I acknowledged the gift, and mounted whilst the groom held the stirrup for me. Oh, it was the oddest of transactions. My lord Gambara, with death in his heart, very reluctantly giving me a life I did not want. I dug my heels into the mule's sides and started across the silent, empty square, then plunged into a narrow street where the gloom was almost as a midnight, and so pushed on. I came out into the open space before the Porta Podesta, and so to the gate itself. From one of the windows of the gatehouse, a light shone yellow, and presently, in answer to my call, out came an officer followed by two men, one of whom carried a lantern swinging from his pike. He held this light aloft, whilst the officer surveyed me. What now? He challenged. None passes out tonight. For answer, I thrust the paper under his nose. Orders for my lord Gambara, said I, but he never looked at it. None passes out tonight, he repeated imperturbably. So run my orders. Orders from whom? Quoth I, surprised by his tone and manner. From the captain of justice. If you must know, so you may get you back whence you came, and wait till daylight. Ah, but stay, I said, I do not think you can have heard me. I carry orders from my lord the governor. The captain of justice cannot overbear these. And I shook the paper insistently. My orders are that none is to pass, not even the governor himself, he answered firmly. It was very daring of Cosimo, and I saw his aim. He was, as Gambara had said, a very subtle gentleman. He, too, had set his finger upon the pulse of the populace, and perceived what might be expected of it. He was athirst for vengeance, as he had shown me, and determined that neither I nor Gambara should escape. First, I must be tried, condemned, and hanged, and then he trusted no doubt that Gambara would be torn in pieces. And it was quite possible that Messer Cosimo himself would secretly find means to fan the mob's indignation against the legate into fierce activity. And it seemed that the game was in his hands, for this officer's resoluteness showed how implicitly my cousin was obeyed. Of that same resoluteness of the lieutenant's, I was to have a yet more signal proof, for presently, while still I stood there vainly remonstrating, down the street behind me rode Gambara himself on a tall horse, followed by a mule litter and an escort of half a score of armed grooms. He uttered an exclamation when he saw me still there, the gate shut, and the officer in talk with me. He spurred quickly forward. How is this? He demanded haughtily and angrily. This man rides upon the business of the state. Why this delay to open for him? My orders, said the lieutenant. civilly but firmly, "are that none passes out tonight." "Do you know me?" demanded Gambara. "Yes, my lord." "And you dare talk to me of your orders?" "There are no orders here in Piacenza, but my orders set me wide the wicket of that gate. I myself must pass." "My lord, I dare not." "You are insubordinate," said the legate, of a sudden very cold. He had no need to ask whose orders were these. At once he saw the trammel spread for him. But if Messer Cosimo was subtle, so, too, was Messer Gambara. By not so much as a word did he set his authority in question with the officer. "You are insubordinate," was all he answered him, and then to the two men at arms behind the lieutenant, "Ho there," he called. "Bring out the guard. I am Egidio Gambara, your governor." So calm and firm and full of assurance was his tone, so unquestionable his right to command them, that the men sprang instantly to obey him. "What would you do, my lord?" quoth the officer, and he seemed daunted. "Buffoon!" said Gambara between his teeth. "You shall see." 6 men came hurrying from the gatehouse, and the cardinal called to them. "Let the corporal stand forth," he said. A man advanced a pace from the rank they had hastily formed and saluted. "Place me your officer under arrest," said the legate coldly, advancing no reason for the order. "Let him be locked in the gatehouse until my return. And do you, Sir Corporal, take command here meanwhile." The startled fellow saluted again and advanced upon his officer. The lieutenant looked up with sudden uneasiness in his eyes. He had gone too far. He had not reckoned upon being dealt with in this summary fashion. He had been bold so long as he conceived himself no more than Cosimo's mouthpiece, obeying orders for the issuing of which Cosimo must answer. Instead, it seemed, the governor intended that he should answer for them himself. Whatever he now dared, he knew, as Gambara knew, that his men would never dare to disobey the governor, who was the supreme authority there under the Pope. "My lord," he exclaimed, "I had my orders from the captain of justice." "And dare you to say that your orders included my messengers and my own self?" thundered the dainty prelate. "Explicitly, my lord," answered the lieutenant. "It shall be dealt with on my return, and if what you say is proved true, the captain of justice shall suffer with yourself for this treason, for that is the offense. Take him away, and someone open me that gate." There was an end to disobedience, and a moment or two later we stood outside the town, on the bank of the river, which gurgled and flowed away smoothly and mistily in the growing light, between the rows of stalwart poplars that stood like sentinels to guard it. "And now be gone," said Gambara curtly to me, and wheeling my mule I rode for the bridge of boats, crossed it, and set myself to breast the slopes beyond. Midway up I checked and looked back across the wide water. The light had grown quite strong by now, and in the east there was a faint pink flush to herald the approaching sun. Away beyond the river, moving southward, I could just make out the legate's little cavalcade. And then, for the first time, a question leapt in my mind concerning the litter whose leathern curtains had remained so closely drawn. Whom did it contain? Could it be Juliana? Had Cosimo spoken the truth when he said that she had gone to Gambara for shelter? A little while ago I had sighed for death and exulted in the chance of expiation, and of purging myself of the foulness of sin. And now, at the sudden thought that occurred to me, I fell a prey to an insensate jealousy touching the woman whom I had lately loathed as the cause of my downfall. Oh, the inconstancy of the human heart, and eternal battles in such poor natures as mine between the knowledge of right and the desire for wrong. It was in vain that I sought to turn my thoughts to other things, in vain that I cast them back upon my recent condition and my recent resolves, in vain that I remembered the penitence of yestermorn, the confession of Fra Gervasio's knee, and the strong resolve to do penance and make amends by the purity of all my afterlife. Vain was it all. I turned my mule about, and still wrestling with my conscience, choking it, I rode down the hill again and back across the bridge, and then away to the south, to follow Messer Gambara and set an end to doubt. I must know. I must. It was no matter that conscience told me that here was no affair of mine, that Juliana belonged to the past from which I was divorced, the past for which I must atone and seek forgiveness. I must know. And so I rode along the dusty highway in pursuit of Messer Gambara, who was proceeding, I imagined, to join the Duke of Parma. I had no difficulty in following them. A question here, and a question there, accompanied by a description of the party. was all that was necessary to keep me on their track. And ever, it seemed to me from the answers that I got, was I lessening the distance that separated us. I was weak for want of food, for the last time that I had eaten was yesterday at noon at Mondolfo, and then but little. Yet all I had this day were some bunches of grapes that I stole in passing from a vineyard and ate as I trotted on along that eternal Via Emilia. It was towards noon at last that a taverner at Castel Guelfo informed me that my party had passed through the town but half an hour ahead of me. At the news, I urged my already weary beast along. For unless I made good haste now, it might well happen that Parma should swallow up Gambara and his party ere I overtook them. And then, some 10 minutes later, I caught a flutter of garments half a mile or so ahead of me, amid the elms. I quitted the road and entered the woodland. A little way I still rode. Then, dismounting, I tethered my mule and went forward cautiously on foot. I found them in a little sunken dell by a tiny rivulet. Lying on my belly in the long grass above, I looked down upon them with a black hatred of jealousy in my heart. They were reclining there, in that cool, fragrant spot in the shadow of a great beech tree. A cloth had been spread upon the ground, and upon this were platters of roast meats, white bread and fruits, and a flagon of wine, a second flagon standing in the brook to cool. My Lord Gambar was talking, and she was regarding him with eyes that were half-veiled, a slow, insolent smile upon her matchless face. Presently, at something that he said, she laughed outright, a laugh so tuneful and light-hearted that I thought I must be dreaming all this. It was a gay, frank, innocent laughter of a child, and I never heard in all my life a sound that caused me so much horror. He leaned across to her and stroked her velvet cheek with his delicate hand, while she suffered it in that lazy fashion that was so peculiarly her own. I stayed for no more. I wriggled back a little way to where a clump of hazel permitted me to rise without being seen. Thence I fled the spot, and as I went, my heart seemed as it must burst, and my lips could frame but one word which I kept hurling out of me like an imprecation, and that word was Tro. 2 nights ago had happened enough to stamp her soul forever with sorrow and despair. Yet she could sit there, laughing and feasting and trolling it lightly with a legate. The little that remained me of my illusions was shivered in that hour. There was, I swore, no good in all the world, for even where goodness sought to find a way, it grew distorted, as in my mother's case. And yet through all her pietism, surely she had been right. There was no peace, no happiness save in the cloister. And at last a full bitterness of penitence and regret overtook me when I reflected that by my own act I had rendered myself forever unworthy of the cloister's benign shelter. Chapter 4. The Anchorite of Mani or Sorrow. I went blindly through the tangle of undergrowth, stumbling at every step and scarce noticing that I stumbled. And in this fashion I came presently back to my mule. I mounted and rode amain, not by the way that I come, but westward, not by road, but by bridle paths through meadowland and forest, up hill and down, like a man entranced, not knowing whither I went nor caring. Besides, whither was I to go? Like my father before me, I was an outcast, a fugitive outlaw. But this troubled me not yet. My mind, my wounded, tortured mind was all upon the past. It was of Juliana that I thought as I rode in the noontide warmth of that September day. And never can human brain have held a sorer conflict of reflection than was mine. No shadow now remained of the humor that had possessed me in the hour in which I had repudiated her after the murder of Fafandi. I had heard Fra Gervasio deliver judgment upon her, and I had doubted his justice, felt that he used her mercilessly. My own sight had now confirmed to me the truth of what it said. But in doing so, in allowing me to see her in another man's possession, a very rage of jealousy had been stirred in me and a greater rage of longing. This longing followed upon my first bitter denunciation of her, and it followed soon. It is in our natures, as I then experienced, never more desire a thing than when we see it lost to us. Bitterly now did I reproach myself for not having borne her off with me 2 nights ago when I had fled for Fanny's house, when she herself had urged that course upon me. I despised myself, out of my present want, for my repudiation of her, 100 times more bitterly than I had despised myself when I imagined that I had done a vileness by that repudiation. Never until now did it seem to me, had I known how deeply I loved her, how deeply the roots of our passion had burrowed down into my heart, and fastened there to be eradicated only with life itself. So thought I then, and thinking so I cried her name aloud, called to her to the scented pine woods, thus voicing my longing and my despair. And swift on the heels of this would come another mood. There would come the consciousness of the sin of it all, the imperative need to cleanse myself of this, to efface her memory from my soul, which could not hold it, without sinning anew in fierce desire. I strove to do so with all my poor weak might. I denounced her to myself again for a soulless harlot, blamed her for all the ill that had befallen me, accounted her the very hand that had wielded me, a senseless instrument, to slay her importunate husband. And then I perceived that this was as pitiful ruse of self-deception as that of the fox in the fable unable to reach the luscious grapes above him. For as well might a starving man seek to compel by an effort of his will the hunger to cease from gnawing at his vitals. Thus were desire and conscience locked in conflict, and each held the ascendancy alternately what time I pushed onward aimlessly until I came to the broad bed of a river. A gray waste of sun-parched boulders spread away to the stream, which was diminished by the long drought. Beyond the narrow sheen of water stretched another rocky space, and then came the green of meadows and a brown city upon the rising ground. The city was Fornovo, and the diminished river was Ataro, the ancient boundary between the Gaulish and Ligurian folk. I stood upon the historic spot where Charles VIII had cut his way through the Allies to win back to France after the occupation of Naples. But the grotesque little king, who had been dust for a quarter of a century, troubled my thoughts not at all just then. The Taro brought me memories not of battle, but of home. To reach Mondolfo, I had but to follow the river up the valley towards that long ridge of the Apennines arrayed before me, with the tall bulks of Mount Giso and Mount Ursaro, their snow caps sparkling in the flood of sunshine that poured down upon them. 2 hours, or perhaps 3 at most, along the track of that cool, glittering water, and the gray citadel of Mondolfo would come into view. It was this very reflection that brought me now to consider my condition, to ask myself whither I should turn. Money I had none, not so much as a single copper grosso. To sell I had nothing but the clothes I stood in, black, clerkly garments that I had got yesterday at Mondolfo. Not so much as a weapon had I, that I might have bartered for a few coins. There was a mule that should yield a ducat or two. But when this was spent, what then? To go a suppliant to that pious icicle, my mother were worse than useless. Whither was I to turn? I, Lord of Mondolfo and Carmina, one of the wealthiest and most puissant tyrants of this Val di Taro. It provoked me almost a laughter, of a fierce and bitter sort. Perhaps some peasant of the Contado would take pity on his lord, and give him shelter and nourishment in exchange for such labor as his lord might turn his stout limbs to upon that peasant's land, which was my own. I might perhaps essay it. Certainly it was the only thing that was left me, for against my mother and to support my rights, I might not invoke a law which would place me under a ban, a law that would deal me out its rigors did I reveal myself. Then I had thoughts of seeking sanctuary in some monastery, of offering myself as a lay brother, to do menial work, and in this way perhaps I might find peace, and, in a lesser degree than was originally intended, the comforts of the religion to which I had been so grossly unfaithful. The thought grew and developed into a resolve. It brought me some comfort. It became a desire. I pushed on, following the river along ground that grew swiftly steeper, conscious that perforce my journey must end soon, for my mule was showing signs of weariness. Some 3 miles farther, having by then penetrated the green rampart of foothills, I came upon the little village of Pogetta. It is a village composed of a single street throwing out as its branches a few narrow alleys, possessing a dingy church and a dingier tavern. This last had for only sign a bunch of withered rosemary that hung above its grimy doors. I drew rein there as utterly weary as my mule, hungry and thirsty and weak. I got down and invited the suspicious scrutiny of the lantern-jawed taverner, who, for all that my appearance was humble enough in such garments as I wore, must have accounted me none the less of too fine an air for such a house as his. Care for my beast, I bade him. I shall stay here an hour or 2. He nodded surlily and led the mule away, whilst I entered the tavern's single room. Coming into it from the sunlight, I could scarcely see anything at first, so dark did the place seem. What light there was came through the open door, for the chamber's single window had long since been rendered opaque by a screen of accumulated dust and cobwebs. It was a roomy place, low ceiling with blackened rafters running parallel across its dirty yellow wash. The floor was strewn with foul rushes that must have lain unchanged for months, slippery with grease and littered with bones that had been flung there by the polite guest the place was wont to entertain. And it stank most vilely of rancid oil and burnt meats and other things indefinable in all but their acrid, nauseating, unclean pungency. A fire was burning low at the room's far end, and over this a girl was stooping, tending something in a stew pot. She looked round at my advent, and revealed herself for a tall, black-haired, slow-eyed wench, comely in a rude, brown way and strong, to judge by the muscular arms which were bare to the elbow. Interest quickened her face at sight of so unusual a patron. She slouched forward, wiping her hands upon her hips as she came, and pulled out a stool for me at the long trestle table that ran down the middle of the floor. Grouped about the upper end of this table sat 4 men of the peasant type, sun-tanned, bearded, and rudely garbed in loose jerkins and cross-gartered leg cloths. A silence had fallen upon them as I entered, and they too were now inspecting me with a frank interest which in their simple way they made no attempt to conceal. I sank wearily to the stool, paying little heed to them, and in answer to the girl's invitation to command her, I begged for meat and bread and wine. While she was preparing these, one of the men addressed me civilly, and I answered him as civilly but absently, for I had enough of other matters to engage my thoughts. Then another of them questioned me in a friendly tone as to whence I came. Instinctively I concealed the truth, answering vaguely that I was from Castel Guelfo, which was a neighborhood in which I had overtaken my Lord Gambara and Juliana. And what do they say at Castel Guelfo of the things that are happening in Piacenza? Asked another. In Piacenza, quoth I. Why, what is happening in Piacenza? Eagerly, with an ardor to show themselves intimate with the affairs of towns. As is the way of rustics, they related to me what already I had gathered to be the vulgar version of Fafani's death. Each spoke in turn, cutting in the moment another pause to breathe, and sometimes they spoke together, each anxious to have the extent of his information revealed and appreciated. And their tale, of course, was that Gambara, being the lover of Fafani's wife, had dispatched the doctor on a trumped-up mission, and had gone to visit her by night, but that the suspicious Fafani, lying nearby in wait, and having seen the cardinal enter, followed him soon after and attacked him, whereupon the Lord Gambara had slain him. And then that wily, fiendish prelate had sought to impose the blame upon the young lord of Mondolfo, who was a student in the pedant house, and he had caused a young man's arrest. But this the Piacentini would not endure. They had risen and threatened the governor's life, and he was fled to Rome or Parma, whilst the authorities, to avoid a scandal, had connived at the escape of Messer Dinguisla, who was also gone, no man knew whither. The news had traveled speedily into that mountain fastness, it seemed, but it had been garbled at its source. The Piacentini conceived that they held some evidence of what they believed, the evidence of the lad whom Fafani had left to spy, and who had borne in the tale that the cardinal was within. This evidence they accounted well confirmed by the legate's flight. Thus is history written. Not a doubt but that some industrious scribe in Piacenza, with a grudge against Gambara, would set down what was the talk of the town, and hereafter, it is not to be doubted, the murder of a store Fafani for the vilest of all motives will be added to the many crimes of Egidio Gambara, that posterity may execrate his name even beyond its already rich enough deserts. I heard them in silence and but little moved, yet with a question now and then to probe how far the silly story went in detail. And whilst they were still heaping abuse upon the legate, of whom they spoke as Jews may speak of pork, came the lantern-jawed host with a dish of broiled goat, some bread, and a jug of wine. This he set before me, then joined them in their vituperation of Messer Gambara. I ate ravenously, and for all that I do not doubt the meat was tough and burnt, yet at the time those pieces of broiled goat upon that dirty table seemed the sweetest food that ever had been set before me. Finding that I was but indifferently communicative and had little news to give them, the peasants fell to gossiping among themselves, and they were presently joined by the girl, whose name, it seemed, was Giovinazza. She came to startle them with the rumor of a fresh miracle attributed to the hermit of Monte or Sorrow. I looked up with more interest than I had hitherto shown in anything that had been said, and I inquired who might be this anchorite. "Sainted Virgin," cried the girl, setting her hands upon her generous hips and turning her bold, slow eyes upon me in a stare of incredulity. "Whence are you, sir, that you seem to know nothing of the world? You had not heard the news of Piacenza, which must be known to everyone by now, and you have never heard of the anchorite of Monte or Sorrow. She appealed by a gesture to heaven against the Stygian darkness of my mind. He is a very holy man, said one of the peasants, and he dwells alone in a hut midway up the mountain, added a second. In a hut which he built for himself with his own hands, a third explained, and he lives on nuts and herbs and such scraps of food as are left him by the charitable, put in the fourth, to show himself as full of knowledge as his fellows. But now it was Giovanazza who took up the story, firmly and resolutely, and being a woman she easily kept her tongue going and overbore the peasants, so that they had no further share in the tale until it was entirely told. From her I learnt that the anchorite, one Fra Sebastiano, possessed a miraculous image of the blessed martyr Saint Sebastian, whose wounds miraculously bled during Passion Week, and that there were no ills in the world that this blood would not cure, provided that those to whom it was applied were clean of mortal sin and imbued with the spirit of grace and faith. No pious wayfarer going over the pass of Sicily into Tuscany but would turn aside to kiss the image and ask a blessing at the hands of the anchorite. And yearly in the season of the miraculous manifestation, great pilgrimages were made to the hermitage by folk from the valleys of the Taro and Bagnanza, and even from beyond the Apennines, so that Fra Sebastiano gathered great store of alms, part of which he redistributed amongst the poor, part of which he was saving to build a bridge over the Bagnanza torrent, in crossing which so many poor folk had lost their lives. I listened intently to the tale of wonders that followed, and now the peasants joined in again, each with a story of some marvelous cure of which he had direct knowledge, and many and amazing were the details they gave me of the saint, for they spoke of him as a saint already, so that no doubt lingered in my mind of the holiness of this anchorite. Giovanazza related how a goatherd, coming one night over the pass, had heard from the neighborhood of the hut the sounds of singing, and the music was the strangest and sweetest ever sounded on earth, so that it threw the poor fellow into a strange ecstasy, and it was beyond doubt that what he had heard was an angel choir. And then one of the peasants, the tallest and blackest of the four, swore with a great oath that one night, when he himself had been in the hills, he had seen the hermit's hut all aglow with heavenly light against the black mass of the mountain. All this left me presently very thoughtful, filled with wonder and amazement. Then their talk shifted again, and it was of the vintage they discoursed, the fine yield of grapes about Fontana Fretta, and the heavy crop of oil that there would be that year. And then with the hum of their voices gradually receding, it ceased altogether for me, and I was asleep with my head pillowed upon my arms. It would be an hour later when I awakened, a little stiff and cramped from the uncomfortable position in which I had rested. The peasants had departed, and the surly-faced host was standing at my side. "You should be resuming your journey," said he, seeing me awake. "It wants but a couple of hours to sunset, and if you are going over the pass, it were well not to let the night overtake you." "My journey?" said I aloud, and looked askance at him. Whither, in heaven's name, was I journeying? Then I bethought me of my earlier resolve to seek shelter in some convent, and as mentioned the past caused me to think now that it would be wiser to cross the mountains into Tuscany. There I should be beyond the reach of the talons of the Farnese law, which might close upon me again at any time so long as I was upon pontifical territory. I rose heavily, and suddenly bethought me of my utter lack of money. It dismayed me for a moment. Then I remembered the mule, and determined that I must go afoot. "I have a mule to sell," said I, "the beast in your stables." He scratched his ear, reflecting no doubt upon the drift of my announcement. "Yes," he said dubiously. "And to what market are you taking it?" "I am offering it to you," said I. "To me?" he cried, and instantly suspicion entered his crafty eye and darkened his brow. "Where got you the mule?" he asked, and snapped his lips together. The girl, entering at that moment, stood at gaze, listening. "Where did I get it?" I echoed. "What is that to you?" He smiled unpleasantly. "It is this to me, that if the Bargelli would come up here and discover a stolen mule in my stables, it would be an ill thing for me." I flushed angrily. "Do you imply that I stole the mule?" said I, so fiercely that he changed his air. Nay now," he soothed me. "And, after all, it happens that I do not want a mule. I have one mule already, and I am a poor man, and—" "A fig for your wine," said I. "Here's the case. I have no money, not a grosso. So the mule must pay for my dinner. Name your price, and let's have done." "Ha!" he fumed at me. I am to buy your stolen beast, am I? I am to be frightened by your violence into buying it? Be off, you rogue, or I'll raise the village and make short work of you. Be off, I say." He backed away as he spoke, towards a fireplace, and from the corner took a stout oaken staff. He was a villain, a thieving rogue. That much was plain, and it was no less plain that I must submit and leave my beast to him, or else perhaps suffer a worse alternative. Had those 4 honest peasants still been there, he would not have dared to have so borne himself. But as it was, without witnesses to say how the thing had truly happened, if he raised a village against me, how should they believe a man who confessed that he had eaten a dinner for which he could not pay? It must go very ill with me. If I tried conclusions with him, I could break him in two notwithstanding his staff. But there would remain the girl to give the alarm, and when to dishonesty I should have added violence, my case would be that of any common bandit. "Very well," I said. "You are a dirty, thieving rascal, and a vile one to take advantage of one in my position. I shall return for the mule another day. Meanwhile, consider it and pledge for what I owe you. But see that you are ready for the reckoning when I present it." With that, I swung on my heel, strode past the big-eyed girl, out of that foul kennel into God's sweet air, followed by the orgies of speech which that knave flung after me. I turned up the street, setting my face toward the mountains, and trudged amain. Soon I was out of the village and ascending the steep road towards the pass of Sissa that leads over the Apennines to Pontremoli. This way had Hannibal come when he penetrated into Etruria some 2,000 years ago. I quitted the road and took the bridle paths on the shoulder of the mighty Mount Prinzera. Thus I pushed on and upward through gray green of olive and deep enamel green of fig trees, and came at last into a narrow gorge between two great mountains, a place of ferns and moisture where all was shadow and the air felt chill. Above me the mountains towered to the blue heavens, their flanks of a green that was in places turned to golden, where autumn's fingers had already touched those heights, in places gashed with gray and purple wounds, where the bare rock thrust through. I went on aimlessly, and came presently upon a little fir thicket, through which I pushed towards a sound of tumbling waters. I stood at last upon the rocks above a torrent that went thundering down the mighty gorge which had cloven itself between the hills. Thence I looked down a long, wavering valley over which the rays of the evening sun were slanting, and hazily in the distance I could see the russet city of Fornovo, which I had earlier passed that day. This torrent was a Bagnanza, and it effectively barred all passage. So I went up along its bed, scrambling over lichened rocks or sinking my feet into carpets of soft, yielding moss. At length, grown weary and uncertain of my way, I sank down to rest and think, and my thoughts were chiefly of that hermit somewhere above me in these hills, and of the blessedness of such a life, remote from a world that man had made so evil. And then, with thinking of the world, came thoughts of Juliana. 2 nights ago I had held her in my arms. 2 nights ago, and already it seemed a century remote, as remote as all the rest of that life of which it seemed a part. For there had been a break in my existence with the murder of Fanny, and in the past 2 days I had done more living, and I had aged more than in all the 18 years before. Thinking of Juliana, I evoked her image, the glowing, ruddy copper of her hair, the dark mystery of her eyes, so heavy-lidded and languorous in their smile. My spirit conjured her to stand before me all white and seductive, as I had known her, and my longings were again upon me like a searing torture. I fought them hard. I sought to shut that image out, but it abode to mock me. And then faintly from the valley, borne upon the breeze that came sighing through the fir trees, rose the tinkle of an Angelus bell. I fell upon my knees and prayed to the Mother of Purity for strength, and thus I came once more to peace. That done, I crept under the shelter of a projecting rock, wrapped my cloak tightly about me, and lay down upon the hard ground to rest, for I was very weary. Lying there, I watched the color fading from the sky. I saw the purple lights in the east turn to an orange that paled into faintest yellow, and this again into turquoise. The shadows crept up those heights. A star came out overhead, then another, then a score of stars to sparkle silvery in the blue-black heavens. I turned on my side and closed my eyes, seeking to sleep, and then quite suddenly I heard a sound of unutterable sweetness, a melody so faint and subtle that it had none of the form and rhythm of earthly music. I sat up, my breath almost arrested, and listened more intently. I could still hear it, but very faint and distant. It was as a sound of silver bells, and yet it was not quite that. I remembered the stories I had heard that day in the tavern at Pogetta, and the talk of the mystic melodies by which travelers had been drawn to the anchorite's abode. I noted the direction of the sound, and I determined to be guided by it, and to cast myself at the feet of that holy man, to implore of him who could heal bodies a miracle of my soul's healing and my mind's purging from its torment. I pushed on, then, through the luminous night, keeping as much as possible to the open, for under trees lesser obstacles were not to be discerned. The melody grew louder as I advanced, ever following the Bagnanza towards its source. And the stream, too, being much less turbulent now, did not overbear that other sound. It was a melody on long humming notes. Chiefly, it seemed to me, upon two notes with the occasional interjection of third and fourth, and at long and rare intervals of a fifth. It was harmonious beyond all description, just as it was weird and unearthly. But now that I heard it more distinctly, it had much more the sound of bells, very sweet and silvery. And then, quite suddenly, I was startled by a human cry, a piteous, wailing cry that told of helplessness and pain. I went forward more quickly in the direction whence it came, rounded a stout hazel coppice, and stood suddenly before a rude hut of pine logs built against the side of the rock. Through a small unglazed window came a feeble shaft of light. I halted there, breathless and a little afraid. This must be the dwelling of the anchorite. I stood upon holy ground, and then the cry was repeated. It proceeded from the hut. I advanced to the window, took courage and peered in. By the light of a little brass oil lamp with a single wick, I could faintly make out the interior. The rock itself formed the far wall of it, and in this a niche was carved, a deep, capacious niche in the shadows, which I could faintly discern a figure some 2 feet in height, which I doubted not would be the miraculous image of Saint Sebastian. In front of this was a rude wooden pulpit set very low, and upon a great book with iron clasps and a yellow, grinning skull. All this I beheld at a single glance. There was no other furniture in that little place, neither chair nor table, and the brass lamp was set upon the floor, near a heaped-up bed of rushes and dried leaves upon which I beheld the anchorite himself. He was lying upon his back, and seemed a vigorous, able-bodied man of a good length. He wore a loose brown habit roughly tied about his middle by a piece of rope from which was suspended an enormous string of beads. His beard and hair were black, but his face was livid as a corpse's, and as I looked at him he emitted a fresh groan, and writhed as if in mortal suffering. "Oh, my God! My God!" I heard him crying. "Am I to die alone? Mercy! I repent me." And he writhed, moaning, and rolled over on his side, so that he faced me, and I saw that his livid countenance was glistening with sweat. I stepped aside and lifted the latch of the rude door. "Are you suffering, Father?" I asked, almost fearfully. At the sound of my voice, he suddenly sat up, and there was a great fear in his eyes. Then he fell back again with a cry. "I thank thee, my God! I thank thee!" I entered, and crossing to the side, I went down on my knees beside him, without giving me time to speak. He clutched my arm with one of his clammy hands, and raised himself painfully upon his elbow, his eyes burning with the fever that was in him. "A priest!" he gasped. "Get me a priest. Oh! If you will be saved from the flames of everlasting hell, get me a priest to shrive me. I am dying, and I would not go hence with the burden of all this sin upon my soul." I could feel the heat of his hand through the sleeve of my coat. His condition was plain. A raging fever was burning out his life. "Be comforted," I said. "I will go at once." And I rose, whilst he poured forth his blessings upon me. At the door I checked to ask what was the nearest place. "Cassie," he said hoarsely, "to your right, you will see the path down the hillside. You cannot miss it. In half an hour you should be there. And return at once, for I have not long. I feel it." With a last word of reassurance and comfort, I closed the door and plunged away into the darkness. Chapter 5. The Renunciation. I found the path the hermit spoke of and followed its sinuous downhill course, now running when the ground was open, now moving more cautiously, yet always swiftly, when it led me through places darkened by trees. At the end of a half hour, I espied below me the twinkling lights of a village on the hillside, and a few minutes later I was among the houses of Cassie. To find the priest in his little cottage by the church was an easy matter. To tell him my errand and to induce him to come with me, To tend the holy man who lay dying alone in the mountain was as easy. To return, however, was the most difficult part of the undertaking, for the upward path was steep, and the priest was old and needed such assistance as my own very weary limbs could scarcely render him. We had the advantage of a lantern which he insisted upon bringing, and we made as good progress as could be expected. But it was best part of 2 hours after my setting out before we stood once more upon the little platform where the hermit had his hut. We found the place in utter darkness. Through lack of oil, his little lamp had burned itself out, and when we entered, the man on the bed of wattles lay singing a lewd tavern song, which, coming from such holy lips, filled me with horror and amazement. But the old priest, with that vast and doleful experience of deathbeds which belongs to men of his class, was quick to perceive the cause of this. The fever was flickering up before life's final extinction, and the poor moribund was delirious and knew not what he said. For an hour we watched beside him, waiting. The priest was confident that there would be a return of consciousness and a spell of lucidity before the end. Through that lugubrious hour, I squatted there, watching the awful process of human dissolution for the first time. Save in the case of Fafani, I had never yet seen death, nor could it be said that I had really seen it then. With the pedant, death had been a sudden, sharp severing of the thread of life, and I had been conscious that he was dead without any appreciation of death itself, blinded in part by my own exalted condition at the time. But in this death of Fra Sebastiano, I was heeded by no participation. I was an unwilling and detached spectator, brought there by force of circumstance, and my mind received from the spectacle an impression, not easily to be effaced, an impression which may have been answerable in part for that which followed. Towards dawn at last the sick man's babblings, and they were mostly as profane and lewd as his occasional bursts of song, were quieted. The unseeing glitter of his eyes that had ever and anon been turned upon us was changed to a dull and heavy consciousness, and he struggled to rise, but his limbs refused their office. The priest leaned over him with a whispered word of comfort, then turned and signed to me to leave the hut. I rose and went toward the door, but I had scarcely reached it when there was a hoarse cry behind me, followed by a gasping sob from priest. I started round to see the hermit lying on his back, his face rigid, his mouth open and idiotic, his eyes more leaden than they had been a moment since. "What is it?" I cried despite myself. "He has gone, my son," answered the old priest sorrowfully. But he was contrite, and he had lived a saint. And drawing from his breast a little silver box, he proceeded to perform the last rites upon the body, from which the soul was already fled. I came slowly back and knelt beside him, and long we remained there in silent prayer for the repose of that blessed spirit. And whilst we prayed, the wind rose outside, and a storm grew in the bosom of the night that had been so fair and tranquil. The lightning flashed and illumined the interior of that hut with vividness as of broad daylight, throwing into livid relief the arrow-pierced Saint Sebastian in the niche and the ghastly, grinning skull upon the hermit's pulpit. The thunder crashed and crackled, and the echoes of artillery went booming and rolling round the hills, whilst the rain fell in a terrific, lashing downpour, some of it finding a weakness in the roof, trickled and dripped and formed a puddle in the middle of the hut. For upwards an hour the storm raged, and all the while we remained upon our knees beside the dead anchorite. Then the thunder receded and gradually died away in the distance. The rain ceased, and the dawn crept pale as a moonstone adown the valley. We went out to breathe the freshened air just as the first touches of the sun quickened to an opal splendor the pallor of that daybreak. All the earth was steaming, and the Bagnanza, suddenly swollen, went thundering down the gorge. At sunrise we dug a grave just below the platform with a spade, which I found in the hut. There we buried the hermit, and over the spot I made a great cross with the largest stones that I could find. The priest would have given him burial in the hut itself, but I suggested that perhaps there might be some other who would be willing to take the hermit's place and consecrate his life to carrying on a man's pious work of guarding that shrine and collecting alms for the poor and for building of the bridge. My tone caused the priest to look at me with sharp, kindly eyes. "Have you such thoughts for yourself, perchance?" he asked me. "Unless you should judge me too unworthy for the office," I answered humbly. "But you are very young, my son," he said, and laid a kindly hand upon my shoulder. "Have you suffered, then, so sorely at the hands of the world that you should wish to renounce it and take up this lonely life?" "I was intended for the priesthood, father," I replied. "I aspire to holy orders. But through the sins of the flesh, I have rendered myself unworthy. Here, perhaps, I can expiate and cleanse my heart of all the foulness it gathered in the world. He left me an hour or so later to make his way back to Cassie, having heard enough of my past and having judged sufficiently of my attitude of mind to approve me in my determination to do penance and seek peace in that isolation. Before going, he bade me seek him out at Cassie at any time should any doubts assail me, or should I find that the burden I had taken up was too heavy for my shoulders. I watched him go down the winding mountain path, watched the bent old figure in his long black gabardine, until a turn in the path and a clump of chestnuts hid him from my sight. Then I first tasted the loneliness to which on that fair morning I had vowed myself. The desolation of it touched me and awoke self-pity in my heart, to extinguish utterly the faint flame of ecstasy that had warmed me when first I thought of taking the dead anchorite's place. I was not yet 20. I was lord of great possessions, and of life I had tasted no more than one poisonous, reckless draught. Yet I was done with the world, driven out of it by penitence. It was just, but it was bitter. And then I felt again that touch of ecstasy to reflect that it was a bitterness of the resolve that made it worthy, that through its very harshness was it that this path should lead to grace. Later on I busied myself in the inspection of the hut, and my first attentions were for the miraculous image. I looked upon it with awe, and I knelt to it in prayer for forgiveness for the unworthiness I brought to the service of the shrine. The image itself was very crude of workmanship, and singularly ghastly. It reminded me poignantly of the crucifix that had hung upon the whitewashed wall of my mother's private dining room, and had been so repellent to my young eyes. From 2 arrow wounds in the breast descended 2 brown streaks, relics of the last miraculous manifestation. The face of the young Roman centurion who had suffered martyrdom for his conversion to Christianity was smiling very sweetly and looking upwards, and in that part of his work the sculptor had been very happy. But the rest of the carving was gruesome and the anatomy was gross and bad, the figure being so disproportionately broad as to convey the impression of a stunted dwarf. The big book standing upon the pulpit of plain deal proved, as I had expected, to be a missal, and it became my custom to recite from it each morning thereafter the office of the day. In a rude cupboard I found a jar of baked earth that was half full of oil, and another larger jar containing some cakes of maize bread, and a handful of chestnuts. There was also a brown bundle which resolved itself into a monkish habit, within which was rolled a hair shirt. I took pleasure in this discovery, and I set myself at once to strip off my secular garments and to don this coarse brown habit, which, by reason of my great height, descended but midway down my calves. For lack of sandals I went barefoot, and having made a bundle of the clothes I had removed, I thrust them into the cupboard in the place of those which I had taken thence. Thus did I, who had been vowed to the anchorite order of St. Augustine, enter upon my life as an unordained anchorite. I dragged out the wattles upon which my blessed predecessor had breathed his last, and having swept the place clean with a bundle of hazel switches, which I cut for purpose, I went to gather fresh boughs and rushes by the swollen torrent, and with these I made myself a bed. My existence became not only one of loneliness, but of grim privation. People rarely came my way, save for a few faithful women from Cassie or Fiore, who solicited my prayers in return for the oil and maize cakes, which they left me, and sometimes whole days would pass without the sight of a single human being. These maize cakes formed my chief nourishment, together with a store of nuts from the hazel coppice that grew before my door, and some chestnuts which I went further afield to gather in the woods. Occasionally, as a gift, there would be a jar of olives, which was the greatest delicacy that I savored in those days. No flesh food or fish did I ever taste, so that I grew very lean and often suffered hunger. My days were spent partly in prayer and partly in meditation, and I pondered much upon what I could remember the confessions of St. Augustine, deriving great consolation from the thought that if that great father of the church had been able to win the grace out of so much sin as had befouled his youth, I had no reason to despair. And as yet I had received no absolution for mortal offenses I had committed at Piacenza. I had confessed to Fra Gervasio, and he had bidden me do penance first, but the penance had never been imposed. I was imposing it now. All my life should I impose it thus. Yet, ere it was consummated I might come to die, and the thought appalled me, for I must not die in sin. So I resolved that when I should have spent a year in that fastness, I would send word to the priest at Cassie by some of those who visited my hermitage, and desire him to come to me that I might seek absolution at his hands. Chapter 6. Hypnerotomachia. At first I seemed to make good progress in my quest after grace, and a certain solatium of peace descended upon me, beneficent as the dew of a summer night upon the parched and thirsty earth. But anon this changed, and I would catch the thoughts that should have been bent upon pious meditation, glancing backward with regretful longings at that life out of which I had departed. I would stir up in a pious rage and cast out such thoughts by more strenuous prayer and still more strenuous fasting. But as my body grew accustomed to the discomforts to which it was subjected, my mind assumed a rebellious freedom that clogged the work of purification upon which I strove to engage it. My stomach out of its very emptiness conjured up evil visions to torment me in the night, and with these I vainly wrestled until I remembered the measures which Fra Gervasio told me that he had taken in like case. I had then the happy inspiration to have recourse to the hair shirt, which hitherto I had dreaded. It would be toward the end of October, as the days were growing colder, that I first put on that armor against the shafts of Satan. It galled me horribly and fretted my tender flesh at almost every movement, but so at least, at the expense of the body, I won back to some peace of mind, and the flesh, being quelled and subdued, no longer interposed its evil humors to the purity I desire for my meditations. For upwards of a month, then, the mild torture of the goat's hair Silas did the office I required of it. But towards December, my skin having grown tough and callous from perpetual irritation, and inured to the fretting of the sharp hair, my mind once more began to wander mutinously. To check it again, I put off the Silas, and with all other undergarments, retaining no more clothing than just a rough brown monkish habit. Thus I exposed myself to the rigors of the weather, for it had grown very cold in those heights where I dwelt, and the snows were creeping nearer down the mountainside. I had seen the green of the valley turn to gold and then to flaming brown. I had seen the fire perish out of those autumnal tints, and with the falling of the leaves, a slow, gray, bald decrepitude covering the world. And to this had now succeeded chill wintry gales that howled and whistled to the logs of my wretched hut, whilst the western wind coming down over the frozen zone above cut into me like a knife's edge. And famished as I felt this coldness the more, and daily I grew leaner until there was little left of my erstwhile lusty vigor, and I was reduced to a parcel of bones held together in a bag of skin, so that it almost seemed that I must rattle as I walked. I suffered, and yet I was glad to suffer and took a joy in my pain, thanking God for grace of permitting me to endure it, since the greater the discomforts of my body, the more numb became the pain of my mind, the more removed from me were the lures of longing with which Satan still did battle for my soul. In pain itself I seemed to find the nepenthes that others seek from pain, and suffering was my Lethean draught that brought the only oblivion that I craved. I think that in those months my reason wandered a little under all this strain, and I think today that the long ecstasies into which I fell were largely the result of feverishness that burned in me as a consequence of a chill that I had taken. I would spend long hours upon my knees in prayer and meditation, and remembering how others in such cases mine had known the great boon and blessing of heavenly visions, I prayed and hoped for some such sign of grace, confident in its power to sustain me thereafter against all possible temptation. And then, one night, as the year was touching its end, it seemed to me that my prayer was answered. I do not think that my vision was a dream. Leastways, I do not think that I was asleep when it visited me. I was on my knees at the time, beside my bed of wattles, and it was very late at night. Suddenly the far end of my hut grew palely lucent, as if a phosphorescent vapor were rising from the ground. It waved and rolled as it ascended in billows of incandescence. And then out of the heart of it there gradually grew a figure all in white, over which there was a cloak of deepest blue, all flecked with golden stars, and in the folded hands a sheaf of silver lilies. I knew no fear. My pulses throbbed and my heart beat ponderously but rapturously as I watched the vision, growing more and more distinct until I could make out the pale face of ineffable sweetness and the veiled eyes. It was the blessed Madonna, as Messer Pordenone had painted her in the church of Santa Chiara at Piacenza. The dress, the lilies, the sweet pale visage, all were known to me, even the billowing cloud upon which one little naked foot was resting. I cried out in longing and in rapture, and I held out my arms to that sweet vision. But even as I did so, its aspect gradually changed. Under the upper part of the blue mantle, which formed a veil, was spread a mass of ruddy, gleaming hair. The snowy pallor of the face was warmed to the tint of ivory, and the lips deep into scarlet and writhed in a voluptuous smile. The dark eyes glowed languidly, the lilies faded away, and the pale hands were held out to me. "Juliana," I cried, and my pure and piously joyous ecstasy was changed upon the instant to fierce, carnal longings. "Juliana." I held out my arms, and slowly she floated towards me, over the rough earthen floor of my cell. A frenzy of craving seized me. I was impatient to lock my arms once more about that fair, sleek body. I sought to rise, to go to meet her slow approach, to lessen by a second this agony of waiting. But my limbs were powerless. I was as if cast in lead, whilst more and more slowly she approached me, so languorously mocking. And then revulsion took me, suddenly and without any cause or warning. I put my hand to my face to shut out a vision, whose true significance I realized as in a flash. "Retro me, Sathanas," I thundered. "Jesus, Maria." I rose at last, numbed and stiff. I looked again. The vision had departed. I was alone in my cell, and the rain was falling steadily outside. I groaned despairingly. Then I swayed, reeled sideways, and lost all consciousness. When I awoke, it was broad day, and the pale wintry sun shone silvery from a winter sky. I was very weak and very cold, and when I attempted to rise, all things swam round me, and the floor of my cell appeared to heave like the deck of a ship upon a rolling sea. For days thereafter I was as a man entranced, alternately frozen with cold and burning with fever. And but that a shepherd who had turned aside to ask the hermit's blessing discovered me in that condition, and remained, out of charity, for some 3 days to tend me, it is more than likely I should have died. He nourished me with the milk of goats, a luxury upon which my strength grew swiftly, and even after he had quitted my hut, he still came daily for a week to visit me, and daily he insisted that I should consume the milk he brought me, overruling my protest that my need being overpast, there was no longer the necessity to pamper me. Thereafter, I knew a season of peace. It was, I then reasoned, as if the devil, having tried me with a masterstroke of temptation, and having suffered defeat, had abandoned the contest. Yet I was careful not to harbor that thought unduly, nor glory in my power, lest such presumption should lead to worse. I thanked heaven for the strength it had lent me, and implored a continuance of its protection for a vessel so weak. And now the hillside and valley began to put on the raiment of a new year. February, like a benignant nymph, tripped down by meadow and stream, and touched the slumbering earth with gentler breezes. And soon, where she had passed, the crocus reared its yellow head, anemones, scarlet, blue, and purple, tossed from her lap, sang the glories of spring in their tender harmonies of hue. Coy violet and sweet-smelling nardosmia waved their incense on her altars, and the hellebore sprouted by the streams. Then as birch and beech and oak and chestnut put forth a garb of tender pallid green, March advanced and Easter came on apace. But the approach of Easter filled me with a staggering dread. It was in Passion Week that the miracle of the image that I guarded was wont to manifest itself. What if through my unworthiness it should fail? The fear appalled me, and I redoubled my prayers. There was need, for spring which touched the earth so benignly had not passed me by, and at moments certain longings for the world would stir in me again, and again would come those agonizing thoughts of Juliana, which I conceived were forever laid to rest, so that I sought refuge once more in a hair shirt, and when this had once more lost its efficacy, I took long whip-like branches of tender eglantine to fashion a scourge with which I flagellated my naked body, so that the thorns tore my flesh and set my rebellious blood to flow. One evening, at last, as I sat outside my hut, gazing over the rolling emerald uplands, I had my reward. I almost fainted when first I realized it in the extremity of my joy and thankfulness. Very faintly, just as I had heard it that night when first I came to Hermitage, I heard now the mystic, bell-like music that had guided my footsteps thither. Never since that night had the sound of it reached me, though often I had listened for it. It came now wafted down to me. It seemed, upon the evening breeze, a sound of angelic chimes infinitely ravishing to my senses, and stirring my heart to such an ecstasy of faith and happiness as I had never yet known since my coming thither. It was a sign of pardon, a sign of grace. It could be naught else. I fell upon my knees and rendered my deep and joyous thanks. And in all the week that followed, that unearthly silver music was with me, infinitely soothing and solacing. I could wander afield, Yet it never left me, unless I chanced to go so near the tumbling waters of the Bagnanza that their thunder drowned that other blessed sound. I took courage and confidence. Passion Week drew nigh, but it no longer had any terrors for me. I was adjudged worthy of the guardianship of the shrine. Yet I prayed and made Saint Sebastian the special object of my devotions, that he should not fail me. April came, as I learned of stray visitors who, of their charity, brought me the alms of bread, and the second day of it was the first of Holy Week. Chapter 7. Intruders. It was on Holy Thursday that the image usually began to bleed, and it would continue so to do until the dawn of Easter Sunday. Each day now, as the time drew nearer, I watched the image closely, and on the Wednesday I watched it with dread anxiety I could not repress, for as yet there was no faintest sign. The brown streaks that marked the course of the last bleeding continued dry. All that night I prayed intently, in a torture of doubt, yet soothed a little by the gentle music that was never absent now. With the first glint of dawn I heard steps outside the hut, but I did not stir. By sunrise there was a murmur of voices like the muttering of a sea upon its shore. I rose and peered more closely at the saint. He was just wood, inanimate and insensible, and there was still no sign. Outside, I knew, a crowd of pilgrims was already gathered. They were waiting, poor souls. But what was their waiting compared with mine? Another hour I knelt there, still beseeching heaven to take mercy upon me. But heaven remained unresponsive, and the wounds of the image continued dry. I rose at last in a sort of despair and go to the door of the hut. I flung it wide. The platform was filled with a great crowd of peasantry, and an overflow poured down the sides of it and surged up the hill on the right and the left. At sight of me, so gaunt and worn, my eyes wild with despair and feverish from sleeplessness, a tangled growth of beard upon my hollow cheeks, they uttered as with one voice a great cry of awe. The multitude swayed and rippled, and then with a curious sound as that of a great wind, all went down upon their knees before me. All save the array of cripples huddled in the foreground, brought thither, poor wretches, in the hope of miraculous healing. As I was looking round upon that assembly, my eyes were caught by a flash and glitter on the road above us leading to the Sissa Pass. A little troop of men-at-arms was descending that way. A score of them there would be, and from their lance heads fluttered scarlet banderols bearing a white device which at that distance I could not make out. The troop had halted, and one upon a great black horse, a man whose armor shone like the sun itself, was pointing down with his mail-clad hand. Then they began to move again, and the brightness of their armor, the fluttering pennons on their lances, stirred me strangely in that fleeting moment, ere I turned again to the faithful who knelt there waiting for my words. Dolefully, with hanging head and downcast eyes, I made the dread announcement, "My children, there is yet no miracle." A deathly stillness followed the words. Then came an uproar, a clamor, a wailing. One bold mountaineer thrust forward to the foremost ranks, though without rising from his knees. "Father," he cried, "how can that be? The saint has never failed to bleed by dawn on Holy Thursday. These 5 years pass." "Alas!" I groaned. "I do not know. I but tell you what is. All night have I held vigil, but all has been vain. I will go pray again, and do you, too, pray." I dared not tell them of my growing suspicion and fear that the fault was of myself, that here was a sign of heaven's displeasure at the impurity of the guardian of that holy place. "But the music!" cried one of the cripples raucously. "I hear the blessed music." I halted, and the crowd fell very still to listen. We all heard it pealing softly, soothingly, as from the womb of the mountain, and a great cry went up once more from that vast assembly, a hopeful cry that where one miracle was happening another must happen, that where the angelic choirs were singing all must be well. And then with a thunder of hooves and clank of metal the troop that I had seen came over the pasture lands, heading straight for my hermitage, having turned aside from the road. At the foot of the hillock upon which my hut was perched they halted at a word from their leader. I stood at gaze, and most of the people too craned their necks to see what unusual pilgrim was this who came to the shrine of Saint Sebastian. The leader swung himself unaided from the saddle, full-armed as he was. Then going to a litter in the rear, he assisted a woman to alight from it. All this I watched, and I observed too that the device upon the banderols was the head of a white horse. By that device I knew them. They were the house of Cavalcani, a house that had, as I had heard, been in alliance and great friendship with my father, but that their coming hither should have anything to do with me or with that friendship I was assured was impossible. Not a single soul could know of my whereabouts or the identity of the present hermit of Monte or Sorrow. The pair advanced, leaving the troop below to await their return, and as they came I considered them, as did, too, the multitude. The man was of middle height, very broad and active, with long arms, to one of which the little lady clung for help up the steep path. He had a proud, stern, aquiline face that was shaven, so that the straight lines of his strong mouth and powerful length of jaw looked as if chiseled out of stone. It was only at closer quarters that I observed how the general hardness of that countenance was softened by the kindliness of his deep brown eyes. In age I judged him to be 40, though in reality he was nearer 50. The little lady at his side was the daintiest maid that I had ever seen. The skin, white as a water lily, was very gently flushed upon her cheeks. The face was delicately oval. The little mouth, the tenderest in all the world. The forehead low and broad, and the slightly slanting eyes, when she raised the lashes that hung over them like long shadows, were the deep blue of sapphires. Her dark brown hair was coiffed in a jewel net of thread of gold, and on her white neck a chain of emerald sparkled somberly. Her close-fitting robe and her mantle were the hue of bronze, and the light shifted along the silken fabric as she moved, so that it gleamed like metal. About her waist there was a girdle of hammered gold, and pearls were sewn upon the back of her brown velvet gloves. One glance of her deep blue eyes she gave me as she approached. Then she lowered them instantly, and so weak, so full of worldly vanities was I still that in that moment I took shame at the thought that she should see me thus, in this rough hermit's habit, my face a tangle of unshorn beard, my hair long and unkempt, and the shame of it dyed my gaunt cheeks. And then I turned pale again, for it seemed to me that out of nowhere a voice had asked me, "Do you still marvel that the image would not bleed?" So sharp and clear did those words arise from the lips of conscience that it seemed to me as if they had been uttered aloud, and I looked almost in alarm to see if any other had overheard them. The cavalier was standing before me, and his brows were knit, a deep amazement in his eyes. Thus a while in utter silence. Then quite suddenly, his voice a ringing challenge. "What is your name?" he said. "My name?" quoth I, astonished by such a question, and remarking now the intentness and surprise of his own glance. "It is Sebastian," I answered, and truthfully, for that was the name of my adoption, the name I had taken when I entered upon my hermitage. "Sebastian of what and where?" quoth he. He stood before me, his back to the peasant crowd, ignoring them as completely as if they had no existence, supremely master of himself. And meanwhile, the little lady on his arm stole furtive upward glances at me. "Sebastian of nowhere," I answered. "Sebastian the hermit, the guardian of this shrine. If you are come to—" "What was your name in the world?" he interrupted impatiently, and all the time his eyes were devouring my gaunt face. "The name of a sinner," answered I. "I have stripped it off and cast it from me." An expression of impatience rippled across the white face. "But the name of your father?" he insisted. "I have none," answered I. "I have no kin or ties of any sort. I am Sebastian the hermit." His lips smacked testily. "Were you baptized Sebastian?" he inquired. "No," I answered him. "I took the name when I became the guardian of this shrine." "And when was that?" "In September of last year, when the holy man who was here before me died." I saw a sudden light leap to his eyes and a faint smile to his lips. He leaned toward me. "Heard you ever the name of Anguissola?" he inquired, and watched me closely, his face within a foot of mine. But I did not betray myself, for the question no longer took me by surprise. I was accounted to be very like my father, and that a member of the house of Cavalcani, with which Giovanni d'Anguissola had been so intimate, should detect a likeness was not unnatural. I was convinced, moreover, that he had been guided thither by merest curiosity at the sight of that crowd of pilgrims. "Sir," I said, "I know not your intentions, but in all humility let me say that I am not here to answer questions of worldly import. The world has done with me, and I with the world. So that unless you are come hither out of piety for this shrine, I beg that you will depart with God and molest me no further. You come at a singularly inauspicious time, when I need all my strength to forget the world and my sinful past, that through me the will of heaven may be done here. I saw the maid's tender eyes raised in my face with a look of great compassion and sweetness whilst I spoke. I observed the pressure which she put on his arm. Whether he gave way to that, or whether it was a sad firmness of my tone that prevailed upon him, I cannot say. But he nodded shortly. "Well, well," he said, and with a final searching look, he turned, the little lady with him, and went clanking off to the lane which the crowd opened out for him. That they resented his presence, since it was not due to motives of piety, they very plainly signified. They feared that the intrusion at such a time of a personality so worldly must raise fresh difficulties against the performance of the expected miracle. Nor were matters improved when at the crowd's edge he halted and questioned one of them as to the meaning of this pilgrimage. I did not hear the peasant's answer, but I saw the white, haughty face suddenly thrown up, and I caught his next question. "When did it last bleed?" Again an inaudible reply, and again his ringing voice. "That would be before this young hermit came? And today it will not bleed, you say?" He flashed me a last keen glance of his eyes, which had grown narrow and seemed laden with mockery. The little lady whispered something to him, in answer to which he laughed contemptuously. "Fool's mummery," he snapped, and drew her on, she going, it seemed to me, reluctantly. But the crowd had heard him and the insult offered to the shrine. A deep-throated bay rose up in menace, and some leapt to their feet as if they would attack him. He checked and wheeled at the sound. "How now?" he cried, his voice a trumpet call, his eyes flashing terribly upon them. And as dogs crouched to heal the angry bidding of their master, the multitude grew silent and afraid under the eyes of that single steel-clad man. He laughed a deep-throated laugh, and strode down the hill with his little lady on his arm. But when it mounted and was riding off, the crowd, recovering courage from his remoteness, hurled its curses after him and shrilly branded him derider and blasphemer. He rode contemptuously amain, however, looking back but once, and then to laugh at them. Soon he had dipped out of sight, and of his company nothing was visible but the fluttering red pennons with the device of the white horse head. Gradually these also sank and vanished, and once more I was alone with the crowd of pilgrims. Enjoining prayer upon them again, I turned and re-entered the hut. Chapter 8. The Vision. Pray as we might, night came and still the image gave no sign. The crowd melted away, with promises to return at dawn, promises that sounded almost like a menace in my ears. I was alone once more, alone with my thoughts, and these made sport of me. It was not only upon the unresponsiveness of Saint Sebastian that my mind now dwelt, nor yet upon the horrid dread that this unresponsiveness might be a sign of heaven's displeasure, an indication that as a custodian of that shrine I was unacceptable to the mire of sin that still clung to me. Rather, my thoughts went straying down the mountainside in the wake of that gallant company, that stern-faced man, and that gentle-eyed little lady who had hung upon his arm. Before the eyes of my mind there flashed again the brilliance of their arms. In my ears rang the thunder of their chargers' hoofs, whilst the image of the girl in her shimmering, bronze-hued robe remained insistently. There's the life that should have been mine. She's such a companion, as should have shared my life and borne me children of my own. And I would burn with shame again in memory, as I had burned in actual fact, to think that she should have beheld me in so unkempt and bedraggled a condition. How must I compare in her eyes with the gay courtiers who would daily hover in her presence and hang upon her gentle speech? What thought of me could I hope should ever abide with her, as the image of her abode with me? Or, if she thought of me at all, she must think of me just as a poor hermit, a man who had donned the anchorite's sackcloth and turned his back upon a world that for him was empty. It is very easy for you worldly ones who read to conjecture what had befallen me. I was enamored. In a meeting of eyes had the thing come to me. And you will say that it is little marvel, considering the seclusion of all my life, and particularly that of the past few months, that the first sweet maid I beheld should have wrought such havoc, and conquered my heart by the mere flicker of her lashes. Yet so much I cannot grant your shrewdness. That meeting was predestined. It was written that she should come and tear the foolish bandage from my eyes, allowing me to see for myself that, as Fra Gervasio had opined, my vocation was neither for hermitage nor cloister, that what called me was the world, and that in the world must I find salvation, since I was needed for the world's work. And none but she could have done that. Of this I am persuaded. as you shall be when you have read on. The yearnings with which she filled my soul were very different from those inspired by the memory of Juliana, that other sinful longing. She entirely effaced at last, thereby achieving something that had been impossible to prayers and fasting, to scourge and solace. I longed for her almost beatifically, as those whose natures are truly saintly long for the presence of the blessed ones of heaven. By the sight of her I was purified and sanctified, washed clean of all that murk a sinful desire which I laid despite myself. For my desire of her was a blessed, noble desire to serve, to guard, to cherish. Pure was she as the pale narcissus by the streams, and serving her what could I be but pure? And then, quite suddenly, upon the heels of such thoughts came the reaction. Horror and revulsion were upon me. This was but a fresh snare of Satan's baiting to lure me to destruction. Where the memory of Juliana had failed to move me to aught but penance and increasing rigors, the foul fiend sought to engage me with seeming purity to my ultimate destruction. Thus had Anthony, the Egyptian monk, been tempted, and under one guise or another it was ever the same Circean lure. I would make an end. I swore in a mighty frenzy of repentance, in a very lust to do battle with Satan and with my own flesh, in a frenetic joy to engage in the awful combat. I stripped off my ragged habit, and standing naked, I took up my scourge of eglantine, and beat myself until the blood flowed freely. But that was not enough. All naked as I was, I went forth to the blue night, and ran to a pool of the Bagnanza, going of intent through thickets of bramble and briar rose that gripped and tore my flesh and lacerated me, so that at times I screamed aloud in pain, to laugh ecstatically the next moment and joyfully taunt Satan with his defeat. Thus I tore on, my very body ragged and bleeding from head to foot, and thus I came to the pool in the torrent's course. Into this I plunged, and stood with the icy waters almost to my neck, to purge the unholy fevers out of me. The snows above were melting at the time, and the pool was little more than liquid ice. The chill of it struck through me to the very marrow, and I felt my flesh creep and contract until it seemed like the rough hide of some fabled monster, and my wounds stung as if fire were being poured into them. Thus a while. Then all feeling passed, and a complete insensibility to the cold of the water or the fire of the wound succeeded. All was numbed, and every nerve asleep. At last I had conquered. I laughed aloud, and in a great voice of triumph I shouted, so that the shout went echoing round the hills in the stillness of the night. Satan, thou art defeated. And upon that I crawled up the mossy bank, the water gliding from my long limbs. I attempted to stand, but the earth rocked under my feet. The blueness of the night deepened into black, and consciousness was extinguished like a candle that is blown out. She appeared above me in a great effulgence that emanated from herself as if she were grown luminous. Her robe was a cloth of silver and of a dazzling sheen, and hung closely to her lissom, virginal form, defining every line and curve of it, and by the chaste beauty of her I was moved to purest ecstasy of awe and worship. The pale, oval face was infinitely sweet. The slanting eyes of heavenly blue were infinitely tender. The brown hair was plaited into two long tresses that hung forward upon either breast and were entwined with threads of gold and shimmering jewels. On the pale brow a brilliant glowed with pure white fires, and her hands were held out to me in welcome. Her lips parted to breathe my name. Agostino d'Anguissola. There were whole tomes of tender meaning in those syllables, so that hearing her utter them, I seemed to learn all that was in her heart. And then her shining whiteness suggested to me the name that must be hers. Bianca, I cried, and in my turn held out my arms and made as if to advance towards her. But I was held back in icy, clinging bonds, whose relentlessness drew from me a groan of misery. Agostino, I am waiting for you at Pagliano, she said, and it did not occur to me to wonder where might be this Pagliano which I could not remember ever to have heard. Come to me soon. I may not come, I answered miserably. I am an anchorite, the guardian of a shrine, and my life has been full of sin must be given henceforth to expiation. It is the will of heaven. She smiled all undismayed, smiled confidently and tenderly. Presumptuous, she gently chid me. What know you of the will of heaven? The will of heaven is inscrutable. If you have sinned in the world must you atone by deeds that shall serve the world, God's world. In your hermitage you are become barren soil that will yield naught to yourself or any. Come then from the wilderness. Come soon. I am waiting. and on that the splendid vision faded, and utter darkness once more encompassed me, a darkness through which still boomed repeatedly the fading echo of the words, "Come soon. I am waiting." I lay upon my bed of wattles in the hut, and through the little unglazed windows the sun was pouring, but the dripping eaves told of rain that had lately ceased. Over me was bending a kindly-faced old man, in whom I recognized the good priest of Cassie. I lay quite still for a long while, just gazing up at him. Soon my memory got to work of its own accord, and I bethought me of the pilgrims who must by now have come and who must be impatiently awaiting news. How came I to have slept so long? Vaguely I remember my last night's penance, and then came a black gulf in my memory, a gap I could not bridge. But uppermost leapt the anxieties concerning the image of Saint Sebastian. I struggled up to discover that I was very weak, so weak that I was glad to sink back again. Does it bleed? Does it bleed yet? I asked, and my voice was so small and feeble that the sound of it startled me. The old priest shook his head, and his eyes were very full of compassion. Poor youth, he sighed. Without all was silent. There was no such rustle of a multitude as I listened for, and then I observed in myself a little shepherd lad who had been wont to come that way for my blessing upon occasions. He was half naked, as lithe as a snake and almost as brown. What had he there? And then someone else stirred, an elderly peasant woman with a wrinkled, kindly face and soft dark eyes, whom I did not know at all. Somehow, as my mind grew clearer, last night seemed ages remote. I looked at the priest again. "Father," I murmured, "what has happened?" His answer amazed me. He started violently, looked more closely, and suddenly cried out, "He knows me! He knows me! Deo gratias!" And he fell upon his knees. Now here it seemed to me was a sort of madness. "Why should I not know you?" quoth I. The old woman peered at me. "Aye, blessed be heaven! He is awake at last and himself again." She turned to the lad, who was staring at me, grinning. "Go tell them, Beppo, haste!" "Tell them?" I cried. "The pilgrims? No, not unless the miracle has come pass." "There are no pilgrims here, my son," said the priest. "Not," I cried, and cold horror descended upon me. "But they should have come. This is Holy Friday, Father." "Nay, my son, Holy Friday was a fortnight ago." I stared askance at him in utter silence. Then I smiled half tolerantly. "But, Father, yesterday they were all here. Yesterday was—" "Your yesterday, my son, is sped these 15 days," he answered. "All that long while, since the night you wrestled with the devil, you have lain exhausted by that awful combat, lying there betwixt life and death. All that time we have watched by you, Leocadia here and I and the lad Beppo. Now here was news that left me speechless for some little while. My amazement and slow understanding were spurred on by a sight of my hands lying on the rude coverlet which had been flung over me. Emaciated they had been for some months now, but at present they were as white as snow and almost as translucent in their extraordinary frailty. I became increasingly conscious, too, of the great weakness of my body and the great lassitude that filled me. "Have I had the fever?" I asked him presently. "Aye, my son, and who would not? Blessed Virgin, who would not after what you underwent?" And now he poured into my astonished ears the amazing story that had overrun the countryside. It would seem that my cry in the night, my exultant cry to Satan that I had defeated him, had been overheard by a goat-herd who guarded his flock in the hills. In the stillness he distinctly heard the words that I had uttered, and he came trembling down, drawn by a sort of pious curiosity to the spot whence it seemed to him that the cry had proceeded. And there by a pool of the Bagnanza he had found me lying prone, my white body glistening like marble and almost as cold. Recognizing in me the anchorite of Monte or Sorrow, he had taken me up in his strong arms and had carried me back to my hut. There he had set about reviving me by friction, and by forcing between my teeth some of the grape spirit that he carried in a gourd. Finding that I lived, but that he could not arouse me and that my icy coldness was succeeded by the fire of fever, he had covered me with my habit and his own cloak, and had gone down to Cassie to fetch the priest and relate his story. This story was no less than that the hermit of Monte or Sorrow had been fighting with the devil, who had dragged him naked from his hut and had sought to hurl him into the torrent. but that on the very edge of the river the anchorite had found strength, by the grace of God, to overthrow the tormentor and to render him powerless. And in proof of it, there was my body all covered with Satan's claw marks, by which I had been torn most cruelly. The priest had come at once, bringing with him such restoratives as he needed, and it is 1,000 mercies that he did not bring a leech, or else I might have been bled of the last drops remaining in my shrunken veins. And meanwhile the goat-herd story had gone abroad. By morning it was on the lips of all the countryside, so that explanations were not lacking to account for St. Sebastian's refusal to perform the usual miracle, and no miracle was expected, nor had the image yielded any. The priest was mistaken. A miracle there had been, but for what had chanced. The multitude must have come again confidently, expecting the bleeding of the image, which had never failed in 5 years, and had the image not bled it must have fared ill with the guardian of the shrine. In punishment for his sacrilegious ministry, which must be held responsible for the absence of the miracle they so eagerly awaited, well might the crowd have torn me limb from limb. Next the old man went on to tell me how 3 days ago there had come to Hermitage a little troop of men-at-arms, led by a tall, bearded man whose device was a sable band upon an argent field, and accompanied by a friar of the order of St. Francis, a tall, gaunt fellow who had wept at sight of me. That would be Fra Gervasio. I exclaimed. How came he to discover me? Yes, Fra Gervasio is his name, replied the priest. Where is he now? I asked. I think he is here. In that moment, I caught the sound of approaching steps. The door opened, and before me stood the tall figure of my best friend, his eyes all eagerness, his pale face flushed with joyous excitement. I smiled my welcome. Agostino! Agostino! He cried, and ran to kneel beside me and take my hand in his. Oh, blessed be God, he murmured. In the doorway stood now another man who had followed him, one whose face I had seen somewhere yet could not at first remember where. He was very tall, so that he was forced to stoop to avoid the lintel of the low door, as tall as Gervasio or myself, and the tanned face was bearded by a heavy brown beard in which a few strands of gray were showing. Across his face there ran the hideous livid scar of a blow that must have crushed the bridge of his nose. It began just under the left eye, and crossed the face downwards until it was lost in the beard on the right side, almost in line with the mouth. Yet, notwithstanding that disfigurement, he still possessed a certain beauty, and the deep-set, clear, gray-blue eyes were the eyes of a brave and kindly man. He wore a leather jerkin and great thigh boots of gray leather, and from his girdle of hammered steel hung a dagger and the empty carriages of a sword. His cropped black head was bare, and in his hand he carried a cap of black velvet. We looked at each other a while, his eyes were sad and wistful, laden with pity, as I thought, for my condition. Then he moved forward with a creak of leather and jingle of spurs that made pleasant music. He set a hand upon the shoulder of the kneeling Gervasio. He will live now, Gervasio? He asked. Oh, he will live, answered the friar with an almost fierce satisfaction in his positive assurance. He will live, and in a week we can move him hence. Meanwhile he must be nourished. He rose. My good Leocadia, have you the broth? Come, then, let us build up this strength of his. There's haste, good soul, great haste. She bustled at his bidding, and soon outside the door there was a crackling of twigs to announce the lighting of a fire. And then Gervasio made known to me the stranger. This is Galato, he said. He was your father's friend, and would be yours. Sir, said I could not desire otherwise with any who was my father's friend. You are not, perchance, the grand Galato? I inquired, remembering the sable device on argent of which the priest had told me. I am that same, he answered, and I looked with interest upon one whose name had been ringing through Italy these last few years. And then I suddenly realized why his face was familiar to me. This was a man who in a monkish robe had stared so insistently at me that day at Mondolfo 5 years ago. He was a sort of outlaw, a remnant of the days of chivalry and free lances, whose sword was at the disposal of any purchaser. He rode at the head of a last fragment of the famous company that Giovanni de' Medici had raised and captained until his death. The sable band which they adopted in mourning for that warrior earned for their founder the posthumous title of Giovanni del Bannier. He was called Il Gran Galato, as another was called Il Gran Diavolo. In play upon the name he bore and the life he followed, He had been in bad odor with the Pope for his sometime association with my father, and he was not well viewed in the pontifical domains until, as I was soon to learn, he had patched up a sort of peace with Pierluigi Farnese, who thought that the day might come when he should need the support of Galeotto's freelances. I was, he said, your father's closest friend. I took this at Perugia, where he fell, he added, and pointed to his terrific scar. Then he laughed. I wear it gladly in memory of him. He turned to Gervasio, smiling. I hope that Giovanni d'Anguissila's son will hold me in some affection for his father's sake, when he shall come to know me better. Sir, I said, from my heart I thank you for that pious, kindly wish, and I would that I might fully correspond to it. But Agostino d'Anguissila, who has been so near to death in the body, is indeed dead to the world already. Here you see but a poor hermit named Sebastian, who is the guardian of this shrine. Gervasio rose suddenly. This shrine, he began in a fierce voice, his face inflamed as with sudden wrath. And there he stopped short. The priest was staring at him, and through the open door came Leo Cadia with a bowl of steaming broth. We'll talk of this again, he said, and there was a sort of thunder rumbling in the promise. Chapter 9. The Iconoclast. It was a week later before we returned to the subject. Meanwhile, the good priests of Cassia and Leo Cadia had departed, bearing with them a princely reward from the silent, kindly-eyed Gelato. To tend me there remained only the boy Beppo, and after my long 6 months of Lenten fare there followed now a period of feasting that began to trouble me as my strength returned. When, finally, on the 7th day, I was able to stand, and, by leaning on Gervasio's arm, to reach the door of the hut and look out upon the sweet spring landscape and the green tents that Galeotto's followers had pitched themselves in the dell below my platform, I vowed that I would make an end of broths and capons, breasts and trout, and white bread and red wine, and all such succulences. But when I spoke so to Gervasio, he grew very grave. There's been enough of this, Agostino, said he. You have gone near your death, and had you died, you had died a suicide and had been damned, deserving it for your folly if for naught else. I looked at him with surprise and reproach. How, for Gervasio? I said, how? He answered. Do you conceive that I am to be fooled by tales of fights with Satan in the night, and the marks of the fiend's claws upon your body? Is this your sense of piety, to add to the other foul impostures of this place by allowing such a story to run the breadth of the countryside? Foul impostures? I echoed, aghast. Fra Gervasio, your words are sacrilege. Sacrilege, he cried, and laughed bitterly. Sacrilege? And what of that? And he flung out a stern, rigid, accusing arm of the image of Saint Sebastian in its niche. You think because it did not bleed. I began. It did not bleed, he cut in. Because you are not a knave. That is the only reason. This man who was here before you was an impious rogue. He was no priest. He was a follower of Simon Mage, trafficking in holy things, battening upon the superstition of poor humble folk. A black villain who is dead, dead and damned. For he was not allowed time when the end took and confessed his ghastly sin of sacrilege in the money that it extorted by his simonies. My God, Fra Gervasio, what do you say? How dare you say so much? Where is the money that he took to build his precious bridge? He asked me sharply. Did you find any when you came hither? No, I'll take oath that you did not. A little longer, and this brigand had grown rich and had vanished in the night. Carried off by the devil, or borne away to realms of bliss by the angels, the poor rustics would have said. Amazed at his vehemence, I sank to a tree bole that stood near the door to do the office of a stool. But he gave alms. I cried, my senses all bewildered, dust in the eyes of fools. No more than that. That image, his scorn became tremendous, is an impious fraud, Agostino. Could the monstrous thing that he suggested be possible? Could any man be so lost to all sense of God as to perpetrate such a deed as that without fear that the lightnings of heaven would blast him? I asked the question. Gervasio smiled. Your notions of God are heathen notions, he said more quietly. You confound him with Jupiter, the thunderer, but he does not use his lightnings as did the father of Olympus. And yet reflect, consider the manner in which that brigand met his death. But I stammered, and then, quite suddenly, I stopped short and listened. Hark, Fra Gervasio, do you not hear it? Hear it? Hear what? The music, the angelic melodies. And you can say that this place is a foul imposture, this holy image an impious fraud. And you, a priest, listen, it is a sign to warn you against stubborn unbelief. He listened with frowning brows a moment, then he smiled. Angelic melodies, he echoed with gentlest scorn. By what snares does the devil delude men, using even suggested holiness for his purpose? That, boy, that is no more than the dripping of water into little wells of different depths, producing different notes. It is in there in some cave in the mountain where the Bagnanza springs from the earth. I listened, half disillusioned by his explanation, yet fearing that my senses were too slavishly obeying his suggestion. The proof of that? The proof, I cried. The proof is that you have never heard it after heavy rain, or while the river was swollen. That answer shattered my last illusion. I looked back upon the time I had spent there, upon the despair that had beset me when the music ceased, upon the joy that had been mine when again I heard it, accepting it always as a sign of grace. And it was as he said, not my unworthiness, but the rain had ever silenced it. In memory I ran over the occasions, and so clearly did I perceive the truth of this, that I marveled the coincidence should not earlier have discovered it to me. Moreover, now that my illusions concerning it were gone, the sound was clearly no more than he had said. I recognized its nature. It might have intrigued the same man for a day or a night, but it could never longer have deceived any but one whose mind was become fevered with fanatic ecstasy. Then I looked again at the image in the niche, and the pendulum of my faith was suddenly checked in its counterswing. About that image there could be no delusions. The whole countryside had witnessed the miracle of the bleeding, and it had wrought cures, wondrous cures, among the faithful. They could not all have been deceived. Besides, from the wounds in the breast, there were still the brown signs of the last manifestation. But when I had given some utterance to these thoughts, Gervasio, for only answer, stooped and picked up a woodman's axe that stood against the wall. With this, he went straight toward the image. Fra Gervasio, I cried, leaping to my feet, a premonition of what he was about turning me cold with horror. Stay! I almost screamed, but too late. My answer was a crashing blow. The next instant, as I sank back to my seat and covered my face, the two halves of the image fell at my feet, flung there by the friar. Look, he bade me in a roar. Fearfully I looked. I saw, and yet I could not believe. He came quickly back and picked up the two halves. The oracle of Delphi was not more impudently worked, he said. Observe this sponge, these plates of metal that close down upon it and exert the pressure necessary to send the liquid with which it is laden oozing forth. As he spoke, he tore out the fiendish mechanism. And see now how ingeniously it was made to work, by pressure upon this arrow in the flank. There was a burst of laughter from the door. I looked up, startled, to find Galato standing at my elbow. So engrossed had I been that I had never heard his soft approach over the turf. Body of Bacchus, said he, here is Gervasio become an image breaker to some purpose. What now of your miraculous saint, Agostino? My answer was first a groan over my shattered illusion, and then a deep-throated curse at the folly that had made a mock of me. The friar set a hand upon my shoulder. You see, Agostino, that your excursions into holy things do not promise well. Away with you, boy, off with this hypocrite robe, and get you out into the world to do useful work for God and man. Had your heart truly called you to the priesthood, I have been the first to have guided your steps thither. But your mind upon such matters has been warped, and your views are all false. You confound mysticism with true religion, and moldering in a hermitage with the service of God. How can you serve God here? Is not the world God's world that you must shun it as if the devil had fashioned it? Go, I say, and I say it with the authority of the orders that I bear. Go and serve man, and thus shall you best serve God. All else are but snares to such a nature as yours. I looked at him helplessly, and from him to Galato who stood there, his black brows knit, watching me with intentness, as if great issues hung upon my answer. And Gervasio's words touched in my mind some chord of memory. They were words that I had heard before, or something very like them, something whose import was the same. Then I groaned miserably and took my head in my hands. Whither am I to go? I cried. What place is there in all the world for me? I am an outcast. My very home is held against me. Whither, then, shall I go? If that is all that troubles you, said Gelato, his tone unctuously humorous, why, we will ride to Pagliano. I leapt at the word, literally leapt to my feet, and stared at him with blazing eyes. Why, what ails him now? Quoth he. Well, might he ask? That name, Pagliano, had stirred my memory so violently that of a sudden, as in a flash, I had seen again the strange vision that visited my delirium. I had seen again the inviting eyes, the beckoning hands, and heard again the gentle voice saying, "Come to Pagliano, come soon." And now I knew, too, where I had heard words urging my return to the world that were the same import as those which Gervasio used. What magic was there here? What wizardry was at play? I knew, for they had told me, that it had been that cavalier who had visited me, that man whose name was Ettore de Cavalcanti, who had borne news to them of one who was strangely like what Giovanni d'Anguilla had been. But Pagliano had never yet been mentioned. Where's Pagliano? I asked. In Lombardy, in the Milanese, replied Gelato. It is the home of Cavalcanti. You are faint, Agostino, cried Gervasio, with a sudden solicitude, and put an arm about my shoulders as I staggered. No, no, said I, it is nothing. Tell me. And I paused, almost afraid to put the question, lest the answer should dash my sudden hope. For it seemed to me that in this place of false miracles, one true miracle at least had been wrought. If it should be proved so indeed, then would I accept as a sign that my salvation lay indeed in the world. If not, tell me. I began again. This Cavalcanti has a daughter. She was with him upon that day when he came here. What is her name? Gelato looked at me out of narrowing eyes. Why? What has that to do with anything? Quoth Gervasio. More than you think. Answer me, then, what is her name? Her name is Bianca, said Gelato. Something within me seemed to give way, so that I fell laughing foolishly as women laugh who are on the verge of tears. By an effort, I regained my self-control. It is very well, I said. I will ride with you to Pagliano. Both stare at me in utter amazement at the suddenness of my consent, following upon information that, in their minds, could have no possible bearing upon the matter at issue. Is he quite sane, do you think? Cried Gelato gruffly. I think he has just become so, said Fra Gervasio after a pause. God, give me patience, then, grumbled the soldier, and left me puzzled by the words.